She was left to die in a blizzard, discarded like broken goods by the man who paid for her passage. But when Lydia Granger collapsed at a stranger's cabin door, she had no idea that the cowboy who saved her life would become the love she never dared to dream of. This is the story of how cruelty led to kindness, and how two broken souls found each other in the harshest winter Montana had ever seen. Stay with me until the very end, and comment below which city you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels tonight. The winter of 1889 came to Montana like a beast unleashed from the deepest circle of hell. Old-timers who had lived through droughts, locusts, and Indian wars would later say they had never seen anything like it. The snow didn't fall, it attacked. It came sideways, driven by winds that howled like a chorus of the damned, piling into drifts that swallowed fence posts and buried cattle where they stood. The temperature plummeted so fast that water froze in buckets before a man could carry them 10 feet. Breath turned to ice crystals the moment it left a person's lips. In the high valley where Elias Rowan had built his cabin 12 years ago, the world had become a white void. There was no horizon, no sky, no earth, only the relentless, swirling fury of snow that erased everything familiar and left behind a landscape as alien as the surface of the moon. Elias sat by his fireplace, feeding another log into the flames, listening to the cabin groan under the assault of the wind. He was 35 years old, though the hard years had etched lines into his face that made him look older. His hair was dark, shot through with premature gray at the temples. His eyes were the color of winter itself, pale blue, distant, carrying the weight of memories he rarely spoke about. He had been alone for a long time. Not just tonight, not just this winter, but for years that had stretched into a kind of permanent solitude. There had been a wife once, Sarah, but that was another lifetime. She had died in childbirth along with the baby, and something in Elias had died with them. He had buried them on the hill behind the cabin, under a cottonwood tree that now stood bare and skeletal against the winter sky. He visited their graves less often now, not because he had forgotten, but because the pain had calcified into something harder, something he carried inside him like a stone lodged in his chest. The cabin was small but well built. Elias had constructed it with his own hands, log by log, choosing each timber from the forest that covered the mountain slopes. There was a main room with the fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder. A root cellar beneath the floorboards held enough preserved food to last through any winter. The walls were chink-tight against drafts, and heavy shutters could be closed over the windows when storms hit. Tonight, those shutters rattled in their frames as if something outside was trying to claw its way in. Elias reached for the tin cup of coffee sitting on the hearth and took a long sip. It had gone cold, but he drank it anyway. His dog, a grizzled old hound named Shepherd, lay near the fire with his muzzle resting on his paws, occasionally lifting his head when a particularly violent gust shook the cabin. "Easy, boy," Elias murmured. "Just wind. Nothing to worry about." But even as he said the words, something felt wrong. He couldn't explain it, couldn't point to any rational reason for the unease that had settled into his bones. He had weathered dozens of storms in this cabin, had learned to read the moods of the mountain weather like a sailor reads the sea. This storm was brutal, yes, but he had seen brutal before. No, this was something else. A premonition, maybe. A whisper from that part of the human mind that still remembered ancient dangers, that still knew how to sense things beyond the reach of ordinary perception. Shepherd lifted his head again, ears pricking forward. A low whine escaped his throat. "What is it?" Elias set down his cup and rose from his chair. The dog was staring at the door. Not growling, just staring, with an intensity that made the hair on the back of Elias's neck stand up. And then he heard it. 3 knocks. Faint, barely audible above the shriek of the wind, but unmistakable. Elias froze. His first thought was that he had imagined it, that his mind, starved for human contact after weeks of isolation, had conjured the sound from nothing. But Shepherd was on his feet now, tail low, hackles raised, padding toward the door. 3 more knocks. Weaker this time, almost like the last desperate effort of someone whose strength was failing. "Jesus Christ," Elias breathed. He grabbed his coat from the peg by the door and shrugged into it, then took down the heavy wooden bar that secured the entrance. The wind hit him like a physical blow when he cracked the door open, driving snow into his face and stealing his breath. He squinted into the white chaos, one arm raised to shield his eyes. At first he saw nothing, just the swirling curtain of snow, the darkness beyond, the howling emptiness of the storm. Then his eyes adjusted, and his heart nearly stopped. There was a woman on his doorstep. She was crumpled against the doorframe, half buried in snow, her clothing, completely inadequate for this weather, plastered to her body by ice and wind. Her face was pale as death, her lips blue, her eyes barely open. One hand was raised, frozen in the act of knocking, as if the effort of those 3 faint strikes had consumed the last of her strength. For one terrible moment, Elias thought she was already dead. Then her lips moved. No sound came out, but he could read the words she was trying to form. "Please." "My God," Elias said, and reached for her. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, or maybe the adrenaline coursing through his veins made her seem lighter than she was. He pulled her inside, kicking the door shut behind him, and carried her to the fireplace. Shepard circled them anxiously, whimpering, as Elias lowered the woman onto the worn rug before the hearth. She was shaking violently, which was actually a good sign, he knew. When a person stopped shivering, that meant the body had given up trying to generate heat. That meant death was close. But she was still fighting, still alive. "Hold on," he told her, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "Stay with me. You hear me? Stay with me." He worked quickly, stripping off her ice-crusted coat, some flimsy Eastern thing that offered about as much protection as a newspaper, and wrapping her in every blanket he owned. Her dress beneath the coat was soaked through, but he hesitated before removing it. Propriety warred with necessity for a brief moment before necessity won. He was a rancher, a practical man. He had seen birth and death, had tended wounded animals and nursed sick cattle. The human body held no mysteries for him, and this woman would die if he didn't get her warm and dry. He turned his back long enough to give her what privacy he could while he prepared dry clothes. One of his own shirts, soft from years of washing, and a pair of wool trousers that would be far too big but would keep her warm. When he turned back, she had managed to strip out of the wet dress herself and wrap one of the blankets around her body. Her movements were clumsy, uncoordinated, but the fact that she could move at all gave him hope. "Here," he said, handing her the dry clothes. "Put these on. I'll make something hot." He busied himself at the stove, heating water for tea, giving her time to dress. When he finally allowed himself to look at her again, she was huddled before the fire in his too large shirt, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, her wet hair hanging in tangled ropes around her face. She was young, mid-20s, he guessed. Not beautiful in the conventional sense, but striking. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, dark eyes that held intelligence and something else. Something wounded. Her skin was still too pale, and her lips still had a bluish tinge, but color was slowly returning to her cheeks as the fire did its work. Elias handed her a cup of hot tea. She wrapped her hands around it, trembling, and took a small sip. Then her eyes met his. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. I thought I was going to die out there." "You nearly did." Elias settled into the chair across from her, studying her face. "What the hell were you doing out in this storm? Nearest town is 15 miles from here. Nearest homestead is—" He paused, doing the mental calculation. 3 miles, at least. The Voss place. Something flickered in her eyes at the mention of that name. Pain, maybe. Or anger. Or both. "That's where I came from," she said quietly. Elias's brow furrowed. Harlan Voss was his nearest neighbor, though neighbor was a generous term for a man who lived 3 miles away and whom Elias spoke to perhaps twice a year. Voss was a hard man, secretive, with a reputation for sharp dealing and a temper that had gotten him into more than one fight at the saloon in town. Elias had no particular quarrel with him, but he'd never trusted him either. "Voss sent you out in this weather?" The woman laughed, a bitter, broken sound that held no humor. "Sent me out. Yes, you could say that." She took another sip of tea, and Elias noticed that her hands were steadier now. "He left me on the side of the road, told me I wasn't what he'd paid for." "What he'd paid for?" Elias repeated slowly. And then understanding dawned. "You're a mail-order bride." She flinched at the term but didn't deny it. "I came from Philadelphia. We exchanged letters for 3 months. He sent money for my passage. I gave up everything, my apartment, my job, what little savings I had, to come here and start a new life. Her voice cracked. When he met me at the train station, he took one look at me and she couldn't finish. The tears came then, silent and devastating, streaming down her cheeks as she clutched the cup of tea like it was the only solid thing in a world that had become quicksand. Elias didn't speak. He knew that sometimes silence was the only comfort a person could offer. He let her cry, let the storm of grief and humiliation run its course, and when the tears finally slowed, he handed her a clean handkerchief from his pocket. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Lydia." She wiped her eyes, took a shuddering breath. "Lydia Granger." "Elias Rowan." He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she shook it. Her grip was still weak, but there was determination in it. "You're safe here, Lydia Granger. I won't turn you away." She stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language. "Why?" The word came out half whisper, half challenge. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Elias was quiet for a long moment, gazing into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough with emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel. "Because I know what it means to be alone in the cold," he said. "And I know what it means when someone offers you warmth. I've been on both sides of that equation, Miss Granger. The world is hard enough without us adding to each other's suffering." The first night was touch and go. Elias gave Lydia his bed in the loft, insisting that he would be fine by the fire. She protested weakly, but she was too exhausted to argue for long. He watched her climb the ladder, moving carefully, still unsteady on her feet, and listened to the sound of her settling onto the straw mattress above. Then he sat by the fire with Shepard at his feet, keeping watch through the long hours of the night. He didn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every howl of the wind brought him back to full alertness. He fed the fire throughout the night, keeping it burning hot, checking the door to make sure the drifting snow wasn't blocking their exit. Once, around 3 in the morning, he climbed halfway up the ladder to check on Lydia. She was sleeping fitfully, murmuring in her dreams, her brow furrowed. He pulled the blanket more securely around her shoulders and climbed back down. By dawn, the storm had intensified. Looking out through a crack in the shutters, Elias could see nothing but white. The snow had drifted up past the windows on the north side of the cabin, and the wind showed no signs of letting up. They were trapped. There would be no leaving this cabin for days, maybe longer. He made breakfast, simple fare, biscuits and bacon and more tea, and was setting the table when Lydia descended the ladder. She moved more steadily now, though she still looked pale and fragile. The shirt hung off her shoulders, and she had rolled the trousers up several times to keep from tripping over them. She looked, Elias thought, like a child playing dress-up in her father's clothes. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Alive." She managed a weak smile, "which is more than I expected to feel when I left the Voss place yesterday." "Sit. Eat." He gestured to the table. "You need to rebuild your strength." She sat, and for a while they ate in silence. Elias wasn't a man who felt the need to fill quiet spaces with words, and Lydia seemed grateful for the reprieve. But eventually, as the food warmed her from the inside and the fire warmed her from without, she began to talk. "I suppose you want to know the whole story," she said. "Only if you want to tell it." She considered this, turning her teacup in her hands. "It started 6 months ago," she said finally. "I was working as a seamstress in Philadelphia. It wasn't much of a life. A cramped room in a boarding house, long hours bent over a needle, barely enough money to keep body and soul together. But it was mine, you know. It was something." Elias nodded, encouraging her to continue. "Then I saw an advertisement in the newspaper. Respectable gentleman seeks wife. Must be hard-working, healthy, and of good character. Western Montana. Adventure awaits." It seemed, she laughed bitterly, it seemed like an answer to a prayer, a chance to start over, a chance for something more than sewing buttons and hems until my eyes gave out. "So you answered the advertisement." "I answered dozens of advertisements," she admitted. "That's how these things work. You write letters, you send photographs, you wait. Most of them never write back. Some write once and then disappear. But Mr. Voss," She said the name like it tasted sour on her tongue. Mr. Voss wrote back, again and again. He described his ranch, his plans for the future, the life we would build together. He seemed kind, thoughtful, educated. He said he was lonely, that he had come west to make something of himself, but had realized that success meant nothing without someone to share it with. And you believed him. I wanted to believe him. Her eyes met Elias's, and he saw the raw honesty there, the painful self-awareness. There's a difference, I suppose. I wanted so badly for it to be true that I didn't let myself see the warning signs. The letters that became more demanding as time went on. The way he asked questions about my appearance, my height, my weight, the color of my hair. The photograph he demanded I send, and the way his letters changed after he received it. Elias felt a cold anger building in his chest. What happened when you arrived? Lydia set down her cup. Her hands were steady now, but her voice trembled. The train ride took 8 days. 8 days of sitting on hard benches, eating stale bread, watching the landscape change from green hills to flat prairies to mountains that seemed to scrape the sky. By the time I arrived in Helena, I was exhausted, filthy, and more nervous than I had ever been in my life. She paused, gathering herself. He was waiting at the station. I recognized him from his photograph, tall, well-dressed, with a face that I thought looked distinguished. I waved, and he saw me, and her voice broke. The look on his face, Mr. Rowan. I will never forget the look on his face, like I was something spoiled, something disgusting. What did he say? He said that I had deceived him, that I was not what I had represented myself to be. He said my photograph must have been from years ago, that I had made myself out to be younger and prettier than I was, and that he had no intention of honoring his agreement to a woman who had tried to trick him. Elias's jaw tightened. That's horse shit. Lydia blinked at the crude language, then surprised him with a small, genuine laugh. Yes, she agreed. Yes, it was. The photograph I sent was taken 3 months before I left Philadelphia. I had not misrepresented myself in any way, but Mr. Voss had apparently built up some fantasy in his mind, some image of what his bride would be, and I did not match it. I was not young enough, not beautiful enough, not enough. So he abandoned you? Not immediately. She wrapped her arms around herself as if the memory brought back the cold. He had paid for my passage, you see, nearly $70. He was not about to let that go without some attempt at recouping his investment. So he took me to his ranch, if you can call it that, more of a shabby homestead, really, and informed me that I would work off my debt before he would provide me with a return ticket to Philadelphia. Elias felt the anger in his chest flare hotter. Work it off how? Cooking, cleaning, mending, whatever he needed done. She met his eyes. And only that. I want to be clear. He made it very clear that he found me physically repugnant and had no intention of touching me, which I suppose was something to be grateful for. But the way he spoke to me, the contempt in his voice every time he addressed me, it was as if I was less than human, a failed purchase, a disappointment. How long did you stay there? 3 weeks. Her voice hardened. 3 weeks of his endless criticism. 3 weeks of being told I was clumsy, stupid, worthless. 3 weeks of watching him drink himself into a stupor every night and wake up meaner every morning. She paused. And then yesterday, he told me he'd had enough. He said that having me in his house was worse than having no one at all. He said he was cutting his losses and putting me out. In the middle of a blizzard. In the middle of a blizzard. Lydia nodded. He drove me in his wagon for maybe a mile, then stopped and told me to get out. I thought he was joking at first. Even he couldn't be that cruel. But he wasn't joking. He said the road would take me to town eventually, and that I was no longer his problem. Then he turned around and drove away. Elias was silent for a long moment. His hands had balled into fists on the table, and he had to consciously relax them. I walked for hours, Lydia continued. Or maybe it just felt like hours. I don't know. The snow was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. I lost the road. I fell into drifts. I got up and kept walking because the alternative was lying down and dying, and I wasn't ready to die. Not like that. not because some cruel, petty man decided I wasn't worth the $70 he'd spent. How did you find my cabin? I didn't, really. I just walked. At some point I saw a light, your window, I think. I walked toward it. I don't remember much after that, just the cold and the exhaustion, and then she looked at him with something like wonder. And then you opened the door, Sauterkat. The storm lasted 5 more days. During that time, Elias and Lydia developed a routine, not by design, but by necessity. They were two strangers trapped in a small cabin, dependent on each other for survival, and the only way to make that situation bearable was to establish order. Lydia took over the cooking. It started on the second day, when she insisted on preparing breakfast to repay his kindness. Elias protested that she didn't owe him anything, but she was adamant. I need to be useful, she told him firmly. I can't just sit here and be waited on. It'll drive me mad. So she cooked. And despite the limited ingredients available, flour, salt pork, dried beans, a few withered potatoes, she managed to create meals that were actually good, better than good. After years of his own bachelor cooking, Elias found himself looking forward to mealtimes in a way he hadn't since Sarah was alive. Where did you learn to cook like this? He asked one evening, savoring a bowl of stew that had no business tasting as delicious as it did. My mother. Lydia smiled, a real smile, one that reached her eyes. She was a cook in a big house before she married my father. She used to say that food was love made edible, that anyone could fill a belly, but only someone who cared could nourish a soul. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was. The smile faded. She died when I was 17. Typhoid. My father followed 2 years later, grief mostly. He just gave up. I'm sorry. Don't be, it was a long time ago. She busied herself with clearing the dishes. But I try to cook the way she taught me. It makes me feel like she's still with me somehow. Elias understood that sentiment better than he could express. There were moments when he was repairing a fence or gentling a spooked horse, when he could almost hear his own father's voice, offering advice, encouraging him to keep going. The dead didn't leave us entirely, he thought. They lingered in the things they taught us, the habits they instilled, the love they left behind. The days fell into a rhythm. Elias would rise before dawn to tend the animals. 2 horses, a milk cow, a handful of chickens that he'd moved into a sheltered area near the cabin. He would break the ice on the water trough, distribute feed, check for frostbite and illness. The work was hard, made harder by the deep snow and bitter cold, but it gave structure to his days. When he returned to the cabin, cheeks red and fingers numb, Lydia would have breakfast ready, coffee, biscuits, whatever she had managed to conjure from his limited pantry. They would eat together, talking about small things, the weather, the animals, memories of places they had known. After breakfast, Elias would tackle other chores, chopping wood, clearing snow from the door and windows, checking the roof for damage. He had survived enough Montana winters to know that maintenance couldn't wait. A small problem ignored today became a disaster tomorrow. Lydia, meanwhile, had taken it upon herself to improve the cabin's interior. She cleaned, really cleaned, in a way Elias hadn't bothered with in years. She mended his clothes, which were more patched than original fabric in places. She organized his kitchen, his supplies, his meager bookshelf. You don't have to do all this, he told her one afternoon, watching her rearrange his collection of tools. I know. She didn't stop working. But I want to. Consider it payment for room and board. I told you, you don't owe me anything. And I told you I need to be useful. She finally looked at him, and there was steel in her eyes. I will not be a burden, Mr. Rowan. I have spent the last 3 weeks being told I was worthless, a disappointment, a failed investment. I will not give anyone else the opportunity to feel the same way about me. Elias was quiet for a moment. I don't feel that way about you, he said finally. Something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or gratitude. She turned back to her work without replying, but he noticed that her movements had softened slightly. On the 3rd evening, they discovered a shared love of books. It happened by accident. Elias was sitting by the fire, paging through a worn copy of The Last of the Mohicans, when Lydia looked up from her mending with sudden interest. Cooper? She asked. You've read it? 3 times. She set down the shirt she was patching. The scene with the massacre at Fort William Henry. I couldn't sleep for a week after reading that the first time. They talked about books for hours after that. Both of them had grown up poor, but both had found solace in reading. Lydia borrowing volumes from the lending library in Philadelphia, Elias ordering them by mail from catalogs whenever he had a few extra dollars. They argued about the merits of Dickens versus Hawthorne, debated whether Melville was a genius or simply long-winded, and discovered a mutual love for the poetry of Walt Whitman. My mother used to read Whitman aloud, Lydia said softly. She said his words were like music. I agree with your mother. Elias reached up to the shelf and pulled down a slim volume. Leaves of Grass. I've read this one so many times, the binding is falling apart. May I? Lydia extended her hand and he placed the book in it. She opened to a random page and began to read aloud. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. Her voice was clear and expressive, nothing like the broken whisper of the woman who had collapsed on his doorstep 3 days ago. Elias listened, watching the firelight play across her face, and felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. He pushed the feeling down immediately. It was too soon, too inappropriate. She was a guest in his home, a woman who had been through a traumatic experience, a person who depended on him for survival. To allow himself to feel anything romantic toward her would be to take advantage of her vulnerability. But the feeling didn't go away entirely. It just retreated to a corner of his heart and waited. On the fourth day, Lydia asked about his wife. They had been skirting around the subject since her arrival. Lydia had noticed the feminine touches still present in the cabin, a delicate vase on the windowsill, a patchwork quilt on the bed, a woman's shawl still hanging on a peg by the door. She had noticed the way Elias's eyes sometimes went distant, as if he was looking at something she couldn't see. But she hadn't asked. Until now. Her name was Sarah, Elias said quietly, staring into the fire. We were married for 3 years. She was the best thing that ever happened to me, and then she was gone. What happened? Childbirth. The word came out flat, hollow. The baby came too early. There was nothing anyone could do. I held her hand while she bled out, and then I buried her on the hill behind the cabin. Lydia was silent for a long moment. I'm sorry, she said finally. I shouldn't have asked. It's all right. Elias took a deep breath. It was a long time ago, 7 years now, but sometimes it still feels like yesterday. Grief doesn't follow a timeline. Lydia's voice was soft. It comes and goes when it pleases. Some days you think you've made peace with it, and then something small, a smell, a song, a particular slant of light, brings it all rushing back. Elias looked at her. You sound like you know something about that. I've lost people too. My parents, some friends, a man I thought I might marry once, who decided I wasn't worth the trouble. She shrugged. Life takes things from us. The only choice we have is whether to let the losses destroy us or to keep going. And you've chosen to keep going. I've chosen to keep going. She met his eyes. Even when it's hard, even when I'd rather give up, because my mother didn't raise a quitter, and I'm not about to start now. Elias felt a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, the first genuine smile he'd felt in days. I think your mother would be proud of you, he said. Lydia blinked, clearly surprised by the compliment. Thank you, she said quietly. That means more than you know. By the 5th day, something had shifted between them. It wasn't romantic, not exactly. It was something subtler, something harder to define. A sense of ease in each other's presence, a comfort with silence. The kind of connection that usually took months or years to develop, compressed into days by the enforced intimacy of their situation. They talked more freely now, sharing stories and memories without the careful guardedness of the first few days. Elias told her about growing up in Texas, about the family ranch he'd left behind after a falling out with his father, about the long journey west that had eventually brought him to Montana. Lydia told him about Philadelphia, about the cramped boarding houses and the endless gray streets, about the dream of wide-open spaces that had driven her to answer Harlan Voss's advertisement. I thought Montana would be beautiful, she said one evening, standing by the window, watching the snow fall. I had this image in my mind, mountains and rivers and endless sky. But when I arrived, all I saw was Voss's face, and all I felt was terror. I didn't get to see the beauty. The storm will end eventually, Elias said. When it does, I'll show you the valley. It's not much, I suppose, compared to what you might have imagined. But it's home, and it has its own kind of beauty, if you know where to look. She turned to face him, and there was something in her eyes, something warm, something that made his breath catch. I'd like that, she said quietly. I'd like that very much. 7. On the 6th day, the storm finally broke. Elias woke before dawn to an unexpected sound. Silence. The wind had stopped. The constant howl that had been the backdrop to their lives for nearly a week was gone, replaced by a hush so profound it felt almost sacred. He rose from his bedroll by the fire, joints creaking from too many nights on the hard floor, and crossed to the window. He pushed back the shutter and caught his breath. The world outside had been transformed. The snow lay in smooth, unbroken drifts that sparkled under a sky ablaze with stars. To the east, the first gray light of dawn was touching the mountain peaks with pink and gold. The storm had stripped the landscape bare of all distractions, leaving behind something clean and pure and impossibly beautiful. "Oh my God!" He turned. Lydia had descended from the loft and was standing beside him, her eyes wide, her lips parted in wonder. "Is it always like this?" she whispered. "No." Elias found himself smiling. Sometimes it's even prettier. They stood there together, watching the sunrise paint the snow in shades of rose and amber, and neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. The beauty of the moment was enough. After breakfast, Elias began the work of digging out. It took most of the day. The snow had drifted up over the door during the night, and he had to climb out a window just to access the exterior. From there, it was hours of backbreaking labor, shoveling paths to the barn, clearing the well, checking on the animals who had miraculously survived the storm with minimal damage. Lydia helped where she could, bundled in borrowed clothes that made her look like a child playing in her father's wardrobe. She wasn't much use with a shovel. Her arms didn't have the strength for serious snow removal, but she carried buckets, distributed feed to the livestock, and kept Elias supplied with hot coffee throughout the day. By late afternoon, they had cleared enough to establish a functional routine. The animals were fed and watered, the paths were passable, and Elias had confirmed that the roof had held through the worst of the storm. "We did it," Lydia said, collapsing onto a snowbank, her breath pluming white in the cold air. "We actually survived." Elias sat down beside her, more tired than he had been in years. "Was there ever any doubt?" "Plenty." She laughed, a real laugh, bright and genuine. "But somehow we're still here." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun sink toward the mountain peaks. The sky was turning shades of purple and orange, and the first stars were beginning to appear. "What happens now?" Lydia asked quietly. Elias considered the question. It was a good one, and not an easy one to answer. The storm was over. The roads would be passable in a day or two. That meant they would have to make decisions about the future. "I suppose that depends on you," he said finally. "You could go to town, find somewhere to stay while you figure out your next step. I could loan you money for a train ticket if you want to go back to Philadelphia. And if I don't want to go back to Philadelphia?" He looked at her. "Then I suppose you could stay here. I could use a hand with the spring work, mending fences, planting, that sort of thing. And—" He hesitated, unsure how to phrase the next part. "And I've gotten used to having someone to talk to. It would be a shame to go back to silence." Lydia was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost wondering. "You would let me stay? After everything?" "I would." "Why?" Elias thought about the question. He thought about the past 6 days, the meals shared, the stories exchanged, the silences that had somehow become comfortable. He thought about the way she laughed, the way she moved through his cabin as if she belonged there, the way her presence had filled a void he hadn't even realized existed. "Because you're good company," he said, "and because I think we could help each other. And because—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because when I look at you, I see someone who got knocked down by life but refused to stay down. someone strong, someone worth knowing. And I don't want to let someone like that just walk out of my life. Lydia's eyes shimmered in the fading light. Tears, he realized, but not tears of sadness. Something else. Something that looked almost like hope. I'd like to stay, she said softly, if the offer is genuine. It's genuine. She smiled then, the fullest, most radiant smile he had seen from her since her arrival. Then I accept. They sat together in the snow, watching the last light of day fade from the sky, and neither of them spoke. There would be time for words later, time to figure out the details, to establish boundaries, to navigate the complicated terrain of two people building a life together. But for now, this moment was enough. The storm was over, and something new was beginning. The next few days were a flurry of activity. Elias taught Lydia the routines of the homestead. She learned how to milk the cow. Bessie, a patient old dairy cow who tolerated Lydia's clumsy first attempts with remarkable grace. She learned how to gather eggs without getting pecked by the territorial hens, how to measure out feed for the horses, how to bank the fire at night so it would last until morning. She was a quick learner and a diligent one. Whatever task Elias set her, she threw herself into with a determination that bordered on ferocious. It was as if she was trying to prove something, to him, or to herself, or to some ghost of disapproval that still lingered from her time at the Voss place. You don't have to work so hard, Elias told her one afternoon, watching her scrub the cabin floor until her knuckles were raw. You're not on a schedule. I know. She didn't stop scrubbing. But idle hands make idle minds, and I can't afford that right now. What do you mean? She sat back on her heels, wringing out the rag. If I stop working, I start thinking. And if I start thinking, I remember. Voss's face when he saw me at the station, the look in his eyes when he left me on the road. The cold. She shuddered. Better to keep moving. Better to have something to do. Elias understood that impulse better than he cared to admit. After Sarah died, he had thrown himself into work with the same desperate intensity. Building fences that didn't need building, clearing land that didn't need clearing, anything to exhaust himself enough that he could sleep without dreaming. It helps for a while, he said quietly. But eventually, you have to face it. The feelings don't go away just because you outrun them. Lydia looked at him for a long moment. You speak from experience. I do. She nodded slowly, as if absorbing this information. Then she went back to scrubbing, but her movements were gentler now, less frantic. I'll face it, she said. Just not yet. Give me a little more time. Take all the time you need. On the third day after the storm broke, they made their first trip to town. It was a practical necessity. They needed supplies, and Elias wanted to send a letter to his brother in Texas. But it was also a test of sorts. The first time Lydia would have to face other people since her ordeal. The first time she would have to navigate the awkward questions and prying eyes of a frontier community that had little patience for privacy. The road was still treacherous, packed snow and hidden ice beneath the surface. Elias drove the wagon slowly, picking his way through the worst patches, while Lydia sat beside him wrapped in his warmest coat. What are the people like? She asked as the town came into view, a ragged collection of wooden buildings clinging to the side of a valley. Frontier people, Elias said, which means they're nosy as hell but will generally mind their own business if you make it clear you want them to. They'll gossip about you for sure, new face, mysterious circumstances, but most of them are decent underneath the talk. Will they ask questions? Probably. Just tell them the truth, or as much of it as you're comfortable sharing. They'll respect honesty more than evasion. The town was called Bitter Creek, named for the water source that ran through the center of it. It wasn't much of a place. A general store, a saloon, a church, a handful of houses and barns scattered along the main road. But it was the nearest thing to civilization for 30 miles in any direction, and the residents had a tight-knit pride in their community that bordered on belligerent. Elias pulled up in front of the general store and helped Lydia down from the wagon. Already he could see curtains twitching in nearby windows. The rumor mill was starting up. Inside the store, they were greeted by Ezekiel Marsh, the proprietor, a portly man with a magnificent mustache and eyes that missed nothing. Elias Rowan. Ezekiel came around the counter, hand extended. Thought that storm might have done you in. Haven't seen hide nor hair of you in weeks. Storm trapped me up at the cabin. Elias shook the offered hand. But I'm here now. Need to restock on a few things. Ezekiel's eyes had already found Lydia, standing a step behind Elias. And who's this then? Don't believe we've met. Elias glanced at Lydia, giving her the choice of how to answer. She stepped forward, chin lifted. Lydia Granger, she said. I'm staying with Mr. Rowan for a while. Ezekiel's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline, but to his credit, he didn't press for details. Well then, Miss Granger, welcome to Bitter Creek. Ain't much to look at, but we call it home. Thank you. Lydia's voice was steady. It's a pleasure to meet you. The pleasure's mine. Ezekiel turned back to Elias. So, what can I get you folks today? They moved through the store, selecting supplies, flour, sugar, coffee, a few bolts of fabric that Lydia eyed with professional interest, fresh cartridges for Elias's rifle. Word had apparently spread faster than wildfire, because by the time they were ready to leave, half a dozen townspeople had found reasons to wander into the general store and get a look at the mysterious woman from the storm. Lydia handled it with remarkable grace. She answered questions politely but briefly, deflecting the more intrusive ones with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. By the time they loaded the wagon and headed back toward the cabin, Elias could tell she was exhausted. You did well, he said. Did I? She slumped against the seat. It felt like being examined under a microscope. That's frontier life. Everyone knows everyone else's business, or thinks they do. He guided the horses around a particularly icy patch. But you held your own. They'll respect that. And what will they think? About us, I mean. A woman staying at a bachelor's cabin. Elias had thought about this. Some will think the worst, can't help that, but most will reserve judgment until they see how things play out. He paused. Does it bother you? What they might say? Lydia considered the question. A month ago, it would have. A month ago, I cared desperately what people thought of me. But now, she shook her head. Now I'm just grateful to be alive. Let them talk. Their words can't hurt me. Elias felt a swell of admiration for this woman who had been through so much and emerged somehow stronger. That's a good attitude to have. It's the only attitude worth having. She looked at him, and there was a fierce light in her eyes. I've spent my whole life trying to make myself smaller, quieter, more acceptable, trying to fit into spaces that were never meant for me. And where did it get me? Abandoned in a blizzard by a man who thought I wasn't worth the price of a train ticket. She set her jaw. Never again. From now on, I live my life on my own terms, and anyone who doesn't like it can go to hell. Elias laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him by her vehemence. Remind me never to get on your bad side. Oh, you wouldn't dare. But she was smiling now, the tension of the town visit draining away. You're too smart for that. The days lengthened. The worst of winter loosened its grip on the valley, although snow still blanketed the high peaks and the nights remained bitterly cold. Elias and Lydia fell into a comfortable routine, not quite partners, not quite strangers, but something in between that neither of them had words for. They talked endlessly about everything and nothing. Books and poetry, politics and philosophy, memories of childhood spent a continent apart. They argued sometimes. Lydia had strong opinions and wasn't afraid to express them. But the arguments were good-natured, more stimulating than hostile. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the walls between them began to crumble. Elias found himself looking forward to her presence in a way he hadn't anticipated. To the sound of her voice humming while she cooked. To the sight of her bent over her mending by the fire, needles flashing in the lamplight. To the quiet companionship of sharing a meal, a book, a sunset. He told himself it was just gratitude. Just the natural human need for connection after years of solitude. He told himself that he was too old, too broken, too set in his ways to feel anything more. But the heart doesn't listen to reason. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the fire burned low and sleep wouldn't come, Elias had to admit the truth to himself. He was falling in love with Lydia Granger, and he had no idea what to do about it. One evening, about 3 weeks after the storm, Lydia asked about the graves on the hill. They had finished supper and were sitting by the fire, as had become their custom. Shepard dozed at their feet, occasionally twitching in dog dreams. Outside, a full moon cast silver light across the snow. "I've seen you go up there," Lydia said quietly. "To the cottonwood tree. But you never stay long." Elias was silent for a moment, staring into the flames. "Sarah and the baby are buried there," he said finally. "I told you about that." "You did, but you never told me about them." "Not really. Who was she? What was she like?" It was a painful question, but Lydia had shared her own pain so openly, had trusted him with her vulnerabilities and fears. Didn't he owe her the same? "She was remarkable," he said at last. "Strong, quick-witted, stubborn as a mule when she thought she was right, which was most of the time." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "She grew up in Missouri, the daughter of a farmer. Came west with her family in '72, same year I did. We met at a barn dance in Helena. I asked her to dance, and she told me I looked like I had 2 left feet, and she wasn't about to risk her toes for a stranger." Lydia laughed softly. "What did you do?" "I told her she was probably right, but that if she gave me a chance, I'd try not to step on her too many times." She laughed, this big, warm laugh that made everyone in the room turn and look, and said I had gumption, if nothing else. His smile faded. "We were married 6 months later. I built this cabin for her. For us. For the family we were going to have. And then she got pregnant, and we were so happy. Happier than I'd ever been in my life. She used to talk about the baby constantly. Was it going to be a boy or a girl? What would we name it? What would it grow up to be? She had such plans." His voice cracked slightly. "But the baby came early. Much too early. And something went wrong. The midwife did everything she could, but there was so much blood. Too much." Sarah looked at me right at the end, and she said he had to stop, to gather himself. She said, "I'm sorry, Eli. Tell our baby I loved them." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. "But the baby," Lydia began gently, "died an hour later. Never even took a breath. I buried them together, Sarah with the baby in her arms." Elias wiped roughly at his eyes with the back of his hand. "And that was that. The end of every dream I'd ever had." Lydia reached over and took his hand. She didn't say anything, no empty platitudes, no meaningless reassurances. She just held his hand and let him feel that he wasn't alone. They stayed like that for a long time, the fire dying down to embers, the moonlight streaming through the window. And something shifted between them. Some barrier that had been holding them at a distance finally crumbled away. "Thank you," Elias said finally, his voice rough. "For listening. For not trying to fix it." "Some things can't be fixed," Lydia said quietly. "They can only be carried. And it helps to have someone to help bear the weight." Elias looked at her, really looked, taking in the firelight dancing in her dark eyes, the gentle curve of her lips, the compassion and understanding that radiated from her. And he realized that whatever he'd been telling himself about his feelings, whatever walls he'd tried to erect, they were meaningless. He loved her, fully, completely, undeniably. But he said nothing, because the time wasn't right, because she deserved space to heal, because he was terrified that saying the words aloud would somehow destroy this fragile thing they'd built. So he squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back, and they sat together in the fading firelight until sleep finally claimed them both. The days that followed seemed to move in a rhythm that neither Elias nor Lydia had consciously created, yet both had come to depend upon. Morning light would filter through the cabin windows, pale and cold, and Elias would already be pulling on his boots while Lydia stirred the embers of last night's fire back to life. They moved around each other with an ease that surprised them both, anticipating needs, filling silences with comfortable presence rather than awkward uncertainty. It was on one such morning, nearly a month after the storm, that Lydia looked up from the biscuit dough she was kneading and said something that caught Elias off guard. "I dreamed about Philadelphia last night." He paused in the doorway, his coat half buttoned. "Good dream or bad?" "Neither, really." She pressed her palms into the dough, working it with practiced efficiency. "I was walking down Market Street, past all the shops I used to know. The milliner's, the bakery, the little bookshop on the corner where I spent too much of my pay. Everything was exactly as I remembered it. but when I tried to go inside any of the buildings, the doors wouldn't open. They were locked. All of them. And I kept walking and walking, trying every door, until I woke up. Elias considered this. What do you think it means? Lydia's hand stilled on the dough. I think it means I can't go back. Not really. Even if I wanted to, even if I had the money for a ticket and somewhere to stay, that life is closed to me now. Those doors are locked. She looked at him, and there was something searching in her gaze. Does that frighten you? Having someone with nowhere else to go? No, he said, and meant it. Does it frighten you? A little, she admitted, but less than it did. Less every day. He finished buttoning his coat and stepped out into the cold, but her words stayed with him as he went about his morning chores. The idea that she was here, not because she had to be, not because she was trapped, but because she was choosing to stay, even knowing she had no other options. There was something both humbling and terrifying about being someone's only safe harbor. The work that morning was harder than usual. A section of fence on the north pasture had collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow, and several of his cattle had wandered into a neighboring valley. It took him most of the morning to round them up and drive them back, and by the time he returned to the cabin, his fingers were numb and his shoulders ached with exhaustion. Lydia met him at the door with a cup of hot coffee and a look of concern. You're frozen through. Come sit by the fire. The fence is down, he said, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. Going to take most of tomorrow to fix it. Then it takes most of tomorrow. She guided him to the chair by the hearth and began unlacing his boots, ignoring his protests. Right now you need to warm up before you lose those fingers. I can do that myself. I know you can, but you don't have to. She pulled off his boots and set them by the fire to dry, then retrieved a blanket and draped it around his shoulders. There. Now drink your coffee and stop being stubborn. Elias found himself laughing despite his exhaustion. Anyone ever tell you you're bossy? Frequently. It's one of my better qualities. She settled into the chair across from him, her own cup of coffee in hand. My mother used to say I could organize a hurricane if I put my mind to it. My father called me his little general. Sounds like they knew you well. They did. Her smile softened with memory. They were good people. Simple people, without much education or money, but they loved each other and they loved me. And they did the best they could with what they had. I try to remember that when I'm feeling sorry for myself. Whatever hardships I've faced, I had a foundation of love to build on. Not everyone gets that. Elias thought of his own parents, the complicated legacy they had left him. His father, stern and demanding, who had never quite forgiven Elias for leaving the family ranch in Texas. His mother, quiet and gentle, who had pressed a Bible into his hands the day he left and made him promise to write. He had kept that promise for a while, but the letters had grown less frequent over the years and then stopped altogether after Sarah died. My folks are still alive, as far as I know, he said, down in Texas. We had a falling out when I left, and we never really mended it. What happened? My father wanted me to take over the ranch. It was all he'd ever dreamed of, building something to pass down to his sons. But I couldn't stay. The ranch felt like a cage to me, like walls closing in. I needed to find my own way, make my own life. He couldn't understand that. To him, leaving was betrayal. And your mother? She understood, I think, but she couldn't go against my father. That wasn't her way. He stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. I've thought about writing to them, especially after Sarah died, but I never could find the words. What do you say to people you've hurt? How do you bridge a gap that wide? Lydia was quiet for a moment. You could start with the truth, she said gently. Tell them you're sorry. Tell them you miss them. Tell them about your life here, about Sarah, about everything. The words don't have to be perfect. They just have to be honest. And if they don't want to hear it, if they've already written me off, then at least you'll know you tried. At least you won't spend the rest of your life wondering what might have happened if you'd reached out. She paused, her expression growing serious. I would give anything to have one more conversation with my parents. Just one. To tell them I love them, to ask their advice, to hear my mother's laugh one more time. You still have that chance. Don't waste it. Her words struck something deep in him, some cord of guilt and longing that he had been carrying for years without acknowledgement. That night, after Lydia had gone to bed, he sat at the small writing desk in the corner of the cabin and pulled out a sheet of paper. He stared at it for a long time, pen in hand, before finally setting the tip to the page. "Dear Mother and Father," he wrote, "it has been too long since I've written. Too long since I've told you that I'm sorry and that I miss you, and that not a day goes by when I don't think of home. I hope this letter finds you well. I hope you can find it in your hearts to forgive me." He wrote for nearly an hour, the words coming slowly at first and then more freely, until he had filled 3 pages with everything he had been unable to say for 7 years. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and sealed it in an envelope. He would post it the next time he went to town. It was a small thing, perhaps, a few words on paper, but it felt like the first step on a journey back to something he had lost. Spring was coming. Elias could feel it in the subtle changes around the cabin, in the way the snow had begun to soften during the warmest hours of the day, in the first tentative birdsong that broke the winter silence each morning. The days were growing longer, the nights less bitter, and the world seemed to be slowly waking from its frozen slumber. With spring came the hardest work of the year. Fences needed mending, fields needed clearing, the garden behind the cabin needed preparing for planting. Elias threw himself into the labor with his usual intensity, rising before dawn and working until his muscles screamed for rest. But this year was different. This year, he wasn't alone. Lydia worked alongside him, learning the rhythms of ranch life with a determination that both impressed and worried him. She wasn't built for this kind of physical labor, her slender frame more suited to the delicate work of needle and thread than to the brutal demands of frontier living. But she refused to be coddled, insisted on doing her share, and Elias found himself both admiring her stubbornness and fearing for her health. "You need to rest," he told her one afternoon, watching her struggle to lift a fence post into position. "You're pushing yourself too hard." "I'm fine," she said, her jaw set with determination. "Just need to get the angle right." "You're going to hurt yourself." "I said I'm fine." But her arms were trembling with the effort, and her face had gone pale beneath the exertion. Elias stepped forward and took the post from her hands. "Lydia, look at me." She did, reluctantly, and he saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the dark circles that spoke of too little sleep and too much work. "This isn't a test," he said gently. "You don't have to prove anything to me. I know you're strong. I know you're capable. But strength isn't about working yourself to death. It's about knowing when to stop." "I can't stop." Her voice cracked slightly. "If I stop, I'm useless. And if I'm useless, you're never useless, never." He set down the fence post and took her hands in his. "Listen to me. You are valuable just by being here. Your presence, your company, your laughter. Those things matter. They matter more than any amount of work you could do." Lydia stared at him, her dark eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You really believe that?" "I do." She let out a shaky breath and looked down at their joined hands. "No one has ever said anything like that to me before. Not Voss, certainly. Not any of the men who answered my letters. They all wanted to know what I could do for them, what labor I could provide, what services I could perform. None of them ever suggested that I might have value simply by existing." "Then they were fools," Elias said, "and you're well rid of them." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she was smiling now, a small, tremulous smile that made his heart ache. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me, for really seeing me." He wanted to say more, wanted to tell her that he didn't just see her, that he couldn't stop seeing her, that her face was the first thing he thought of when he woke and the last thing he imagined before he slept. But the words caught in his throat, trapped behind years of loss and fear. Instead, he squeezed her hands gently and said, "Come on, let's get you inside. I'll finish up here." "But the fence? We'll still be here tomorrow. Some things can wait." She didn't argue further, and he took that as a sign of how truly exhausted she was. He walked her back to the cabin, settled her in the chair by the fire with a blanket and a cup of tea, and then returned to the fence line alone. As he worked, driving posts into the still frozen ground, he thought about what she had said, about the men who had only seen her as a means to an end, a collection of skills and services rather than a human being with her own needs and dreams. He thought about Harlan Voss, the man who had paid for her passage and then discarded her like a defective purchase. He thought about the cruelty of a world that reduced people to their utility, that measured worth in labor and productivity rather than in kindness and compassion. And he made a silent vow that he would never make her feel that way. Whatever happened between them, whatever the future held, he would never treat her as anything less than the remarkable woman she was. The following week brought an unexpected visitor to the cabin. Elias was splitting wood behind the house when he heard the sound of hooves on the trail, and he straightened up, axe in hand, to see a rider approaching through the trees. It was Marshal Tom Brennan, a weathered man in his 60s who served as the law in this remote corner of Montana. He rode a gray gelding that had seen better days, and his face wore the tired expression of someone who had traveled too far to deliver news he didn't want to give. "Elias," the marshal said, touching the brim of his hat. "Been a while." "Tom." Elias set down the axe and wiped his hands on his trousers. "What brings you out this way?" The marshal dismounted, his joints creaking in protest. "Wish I could say it was a social call, but I'm afraid I've got business." He glanced toward the cabin, where smoke was rising from the chimney. "I hear you've got a woman staying with you. Philadelphia girl. Came out as a mail-order bride for Harlan Voss?" Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "What about her?" "Voss has been making noise in town, says she stole from him before she left. Says he wants her brought in to answer for it." "That's a damned lie!" The words came out harder than Elias intended. "She didn't steal anything. He abandoned her in the middle of a blizzard, left her to die. Whatever he's claiming, it's nothing but spite." The marshal held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I believe you, and between you and me, I've never had much use for Harlan Voss. But he's been talking to anyone who'll listen, and some of the town folk are starting to ask questions. I thought you should know." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that make life difficult." Tom's expression was sympathetic but uneasy. "There's talk about the two of you living together out here, unmarried. Some of the church ladies are worked up about it, and with Voss throwing around accusations, well, it doesn't look good." Elias felt his jaw tighten. "Since when do I care what the church ladies think?" "You don't have to care." "But she might. If this goes south, it'll be her reputation that suffers most." The marshal glanced toward the cabin again. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Elias. I'm here to warn you. Voss is stirring up a hornet's nest, and sooner or later someone's going to get stung." The cabin door opened and Lydia emerged, wiping her hands on an apron. She had clearly been cooking. There was flour on her cheek and in her hair, and the smell of fresh bread wafted out behind her. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her eyes moving between Elias and the marshal. "Fine," Elias said, but his voice was tighter than he wanted it to be. Marshal Brennan was just leaving. Tom touched his hat again. "Ma'am." He turned back to Elias. "Think about what I said, and be careful. Voss isn't the forgiving type." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving behind a silence that seemed to press down on the clearing like a physical weight. "What did he want?" Lydia asked when the marshal had disappeared into the trees. Elias considered lying to her, telling her it was nothing to worry about. But she deserved the truth. She had always given him the truth, even when it was painful. "Voss is telling people you stole from him," he said, "and he's stirring up gossip about us, about our situation." Lydia's face went pale. "I didn't steal anything. I swear to you, I took nothing from that house but the clothes on my back." "I know you didn't." He crossed to her and took her hands, a gesture that was becoming increasingly natural between them. "I believe you. But Voss doesn't care about the truth. He cares about hurting you." "Why?" Her voice was small, almost childlike. "I didn't do anything to him. He's the one who brought me here under false pretenses. He's the one who left me to die. Why would he want to hurt me more?" "Because you survived," Elias said grimly. "Because you're happy. Because your existence is a reminder of what he did, and men like Voss can't stand to be reminded of their own cruelty." Lydia was silent for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. "What do we do?" "For now? Nothing. We go about our lives, we ignore the gossip, and we don't give him the satisfaction of seeing us upset." He squeezed her hands. "But if he comes here, if he tries anything, I'll be ready. I don't want you to get hurt because of me. You're not going to hurt me. He is. And I've dealt with men like him before. There was steel in his voice now, the hardness of a man who had learned to protect what was his. He's not going to touch you, Lydia. I swear to you on my life. She looked at him for a long moment, and then, to his surprise, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him in a fierce embrace. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact between them, and for a moment Elias was too startled to respond. Then his arms came up around her, holding her close, feeling the warmth of her body against his chest. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "Thank you for being on my side." "Always," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the cold spring air, while somewhere in the distance, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. The weeks that followed were tense, marked by an undercurrent of anxiety that neither of them could quite shake. They went about their daily routines, working the land and tending the animals, but there was a watchfulness in their movements now, an awareness of every sound and shadow that might herald Voss's arrival. He didn't come. Not yet. But his presence was felt in other ways. When Elias went to town for supplies, he noticed the sidelong glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when he approached. The proprietor of the general store, Ezekiel Marsh, remained friendly, but there was a wariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Don't let it get to you," Ezekiel advised one afternoon, weighing out a bag of flour. "Small towns run on gossip. Give them a few weeks and they'll find something else to talk about. And in the meantime? In the meantime, keep your head down and your powder dry." The older man's expression grew serious. "And keep an eye on that woman of yours. Voss has been drinking more than usual, and liquor makes him mean." Elias filed that information away and headed home, his mind churning with plans and contingencies. He had always been a peaceful man, preferring solitude to conflict, but he had learned early in life that some fights couldn't be avoided. If Voss came looking for trouble, Elias would be ready to give it to him. But the trouble, when it came, took a different form than he expected. It was Lydia who faced it first, and she faced it alone. She had gone to town by herself one morning, insisting that she was perfectly capable of handling the simple errand of posting a letter and buying thread. Elias had been reluctant to let her go alone, but she had pointed out that she couldn't live her life in hiding, couldn't let Voss's threats dictate her every movement. "I refuse to be a prisoner," she had said firmly. "I spent 3 weeks as Voss's prisoner, and I won't go back to that. I need to show this town that I'm not afraid of him." So he had let her go, watching from the doorway as she drove the wagon down the trail, her back straight and her chin lifted with determination. And he had spent the next several hours pacing the cabin like a caged animal, unable to focus on any of the work that needed doing. When she finally returned several hours later than expected, her face was pale and her hands were shaking on the reins. She didn't say anything as she climbed down from the wagon, didn't respond when he asked what had happened. She just walked past him into the cabin and sat down by the fire, staring into the flames with an expression he couldn't read. Elias followed her inside, his heart pounding with fear. "Lydia, talk to me. What happened?" "I saw him," she said quietly. "In town. Outside the general store." The cold knot in Elias's stomach tightened. "What did he do?" "Nothing. Everything." She wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold something inside. "He just looked at me. Smiled. This horrible knowing smile, like he had a secret I didn't want to know. And then he said, 'Enjoy it while it lasts, Miss Granger. Everything ends eventually.'" "That's all he said?" "That's all." She finally looked at him, and he saw the fear in her eyes, carefully controlled but unmistakable. But it was the way he said it. Like he was making a promise. Like he was looking forward to something. Elias knelt before her, taking her cold hands in his. "Listen to me. He's trying to scare you. That's all this is. He wants you to be afraid, to feel powerless, because that makes him feel strong. But you're not powerless. You have a home here. You have friends in town, whether you know it yet or not. And you have me. But what if he won't?" Elias's voice was fierce. "I don't care what he's planning. I don't care what threats he makes. He will not touch you. I will make sure of that." Lydia searched his face, looking for something, some assurance that she could believe in. Whatever she found there seemed to steady her because she let out a long breath and nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "I believe you." "Good." He squeezed her hands. "Now, I think we both could use some dinner. And then maybe a chapter of that Dickens novel you've been reading me?" A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "You actually like me reading to you?" "I like the sound of your voice," he admitted. "It's peaceful." The smile grew stronger. "Then dinner and Dickens it is." That night, as she read aloud from Great Expectations, her voice filling the cabin with the story of Pip and his impossible dreams, Elias watched her face in the firelight and felt something shift inside him. This was what he wanted, he realized. Not just for tonight, not just for this difficult season, but for the rest of his life. He wanted her voice, her presence, her companionship. He wanted to wake up to her face and fall asleep to her laughter. He wanted to grow old with her, to share whatever years remained to him with this remarkable woman who had stumbled into his life in the midst of a storm. But wanting wasn't enough. Not yet. There were obstacles to overcome, dangers to face, bridges to build. Voss was still out there, circling like a wolf, waiting for his moment. The town's judgment hung over them like a cloud. And Lydia herself was still healing, still finding her footing in a world that had treated her so cruelly. He would wait, he would be patient, he would earn her trust day by day, action by action, until the time was right to speak the words that burned in his heart. And when that time came, he would hold nothing back. The incident in town had rattled Lydia more than she wanted to admit, but it had also ignited something within her, a spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. In the days that followed, she threw herself into the work of the homestead with renewed vigor, not because she was trying to prove her worth, but because she was claiming her place. This was her home now, and she would not be driven from it by fear. She began making changes, small at first, but growing bolder as time went on. She planted flowers by the door, bright splashes of color that would bloom when summer came. She sewed curtains for the windows, transforming the cabin's rough interior into something almost cozy. She reorganized the kitchen, the pantry, the storage cellar, imposing an order that made everything more efficient. Elias watched these changes with a mixture of amusement and wonder. "You're making this place look almost civilized," he observed one evening, taking in the new curtains and the vase of wildflowers on the table. "It needed civilizing," she replied tartly. "How did you survive all these years with no proper organization system?" "Barely, apparently." He grinned at her expression. "I like it, though. The changes. They feel right." "They do, don't they?" She looked around the cabin with satisfaction. "It feels less like I'm staying in someone else's home now. More like—" She trailed off as if afraid to finish the thought. "More like it's yours," Elias finished for her. She met his eyes, and something unspoken passed between them. "Yes," she said quietly. "More like it's mine." That night, as they sat together by the fire, the conversation turned to the future in a way it never had before. They had been living day to day, focused on immediate survival and the looming threat of Voss, but now, for the first time, they began to talk about what came next. "I've been thinking," Lydia said, her voice carefully neutral, "about what I'll do when things settle down." Elias felt his heart constrict. "What do you mean?" "I can't impose on your hospitality forever. At some point, I'll need to find my own way. Get a job in town, perhaps. Find a room in a boarding house." She kept her eyes on the fire, not looking at him. "I've been saving what little money I had, and if I could find work as a seamstress, I might be able to—" "Is that what you want?" he interrupted. "To leave?" She was silent for a long moment. "I don't know what I want," she admitted. "I only know what I think I should do. What would be proper? What would stop people from talking? To hell with what's proper." The words came out more forcefully than he intended, and she looked at him in surprise. "I'm serious. I don't give a damn what people think, and neither should you. The only question that matters is this. Are you happy here?" She hesitated. "Yes, I am. Happier than I've been in a very long time." "Then stay." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Stay because you want to, not because you have nowhere else to go. Stay because this feels like home. Stay because—" He paused, gathering his courage. "Because I want you here. Not as a guest, not as someone working off a debt, but as part of this place. Part of my life." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Lydia's eyes were wide, her lips parted slightly, and Elias could see the rapid rise and fall of her chest as she processed his words. "Elias," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "What exactly are you saying?" He had come too far to turn back now. The words had been building inside him for weeks, months, and they would not be contained any longer. "I'm saying that I've spent 7 years alone in this cabin, telling myself that solitude was what I wanted, that I was better off without anyone to care about. And then you showed up, half dead on my doorstep, and everything changed." He reached out and took her hand gently, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. "I'm saying that I can't imagine this place without you anymore, that I don't want to imagine it, that when I think about the future, you're in it, every version of it." "But Sarah—" "Sarah is gone," he said, and though the words still hurt, they no longer carried the crushing weight they once had. "I loved her. I will always love her. But she would be the first to tell me that life is for the living, and that I've spent too long hiding in the shadows of grief." He squeezed Lydia's hand. "You brought me back into the light. You reminded me what it feels like to hope again. And I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose you." Lydia's eyes shimmered with tears, but she was smiling now, a tremulous smile that seemed to light up the entire room. "I thought I was imagining it, the way you looked at me sometimes, the things you said. I told myself I was foolish, that a man like you couldn't possibly feel anything for a woman like me." "A woman like you?" He shook his head in disbelief. "A woman who survived everything life threw at her and came out stronger? A woman who can cook and sew and argue about literature and make me laugh for the first time in years? What man wouldn't feel something for a woman like that? Harlan Voss, for one. Harlan Voss is a fool and a coward. His judgment means nothing." Elias lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "My judgment, on the other hand, is impeccable. And my judgment says that you, Lydia Granger, are the most remarkable woman I have ever met." The tears spilled over now, running down her cheeks, but she was laughing through them, a sound of pure joy that filled the cabin like music. "You're ridiculous," she said. "Absolutely ridiculous." "Probably," he agreed. "But I'm also right." She pulled her hand from his, and for one terrible moment he thought he had misread everything. Then she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, and the world fell away. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, two people who had both been hurt learning to trust again, but it deepened quickly, fed by months of suppressed longing and unspoken desire. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Elias felt as if he had been struck by lightning. "Well," Lydia said, her voice slightly unsteady, "I suppose that settles it." "Settles what?" "Whether I'm staying." She smiled at him, that radiant smile that made his heart ache. "I'm staying, Elias Rowan, if you'll have me." "I'll have you," he said, and pulled her into his arms. "For as long as you'll let me. For the rest of my life, if you're willing." They held each other in the firelight, not speaking, not needing to speak. The future was still uncertain, full of obstacles and challenges they couldn't yet foresee. But in that moment, none of it mattered. They had found each other, and that was enough. The transformation in their relationship was subtle at first, more a shift in atmosphere than any dramatic change in behavior. They still slept in separate quarters, she in the loft and he by the fire, respecting the boundaries of propriety even as those boundaries began to blur. But there was a new warmth between them now, a freedom in their interactions that hadn't existed before. Elias found himself reaching for her hand without thinking, and she would lace her fingers through his as naturally as breathing. They sat closer together in the evenings, her head sometimes resting on his shoulder as she read aloud. He caught himself watching her face when she wasn't looking, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the way her brow furrowed when she was concentrating, the quick flash of her smile. And she watched him too, he knew. He would look up from his work to find her eyes on him, soft with an emotion that made his breath catch in his throat. They didn't speak of marriage. Not yet. There were too many complications, Too many unresolved threads that needed to be addressed first. But the understanding was there, unspoken between them, a promise waiting to be made formal. The town gossip, predictably, intensified. Word had spread that the Rowan place had been transformed, that the solitary rancher was now rarely seen without the mysterious woman from Philadelphia at his side. Some of the talk was curious, some disapproving, some merely speculative. But there were also unexpected allies. Martha Henderson, the formidable matriarch of one of the valley's oldest families, showed up at the cabin one afternoon with a basket of preserves and a no-nonsense expression. "Thought it was time I met the woman everyone's talking about," she announced, marching past Elias without waiting for an invitation. "Well, where is she?" Lydia emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, and the two women sized each other up like generals on opposite sides of a battlefield. "Mrs. Henderson," Lydia said, her voice remarkably steady, "I've heard a great deal about you." "I'm sure you have, most of it probably unflattering." Martha set down her basket and fixed Lydia with a penetrating stare. "They say you came out here to marry Harlan Voss, and he threw you out in a blizzard. That true?" Lydia didn't flinch. "It's true. They say you've been living here with Elias Rowan ever since, unmarried and unashamed. Also true. And they say you're a schemer, a thief, and a woman of loose morals." "That," Lydia said coolly, "is a lie." Martha stared at her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to Elias's astonishment, she burst out laughing. "Good," she said. "You've got spine. Can't stand a woman who crumbles at the first sign of opposition." She turned to Elias, her eyes twinkling. "She'll do, Rowan. She'll do just fine." After that, Martha Henderson became their unlikely champion. She spread word throughout the valley that Lydia Granger was a respectable woman who had been wronged by a dishonorable man, and that anyone who suggested otherwise would have to answer to her personally. Given Martha's formidable reputation, this effectively silenced much of the negative gossip. But Voss remained a problem. He had not approached the cabin again, had not made any overt moves against them, but his presence was a constant shadow on the edge of their happiness. Elias knew it was only a matter of time before he acted. The confrontation came on a bright spring morning when the last of the snow had finally melted from the valley floor and the first green shoots were pushing through the dark earth. Elias was in the barn, grooming one of the horses, when he heard the sound of an approaching wagon. He knew, before he even saw the vehicle, who it would be. Harlan Voss pulled into the clearing with the air of a man who owned everything he surveyed. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the meanness that lurked behind his eyes. He was dressed in his finest clothes, as if coming to call on a lady, but there was nothing gentlemanly in his expression. Elias stepped out of the barn, positioning himself between the wagon and the cabin. "Voss?" "Rowan." Harlan's lips curved in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Nice morning for a visit, don't you think?" "Depends on why you're visiting." "Oh, I think you know why." Harlan climbed down from the wagon, moving with the casual confidence of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. "I've come for what's mine. Nothing here belongs to you." "That's where you're wrong." Harlan's smile widened. "The woman you've been harboring, the one who's been playing house with you all winter, she came to Montana as my bride. I paid for her passage. That makes her my property." "She's not property." Elias's voice was low, dangerous. "She's a human being who you abandoned in a blizzard to die. You lost any claim to her the moment you drove away." "Did I?" Harlan reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I have here the original contract, signed by both parties. She agreed to come to Montana as my bride, and I agreed to pay her expenses. The contract was never formally dissolved. In the eyes of the law, she still belongs to me." Elias felt his hands curl into fists at his sides. "And what exactly do you want?" "I want her back, of course, or failing that, compensation for my losses. The passage cost me $70. Add in the cost of room and board during the 3 weeks she stayed at my place, and let's call it an even 100. The cabin door opened behind Elias, and Lydia stepped out onto the porch. Her face was pale but composed, her spine straight, her chin lifted with defiance. "I don't belong to anyone," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. And your contract is worthless. You broke its terms when you refused to honor the marriage agreement, when you left me to die in the snow. Harlan's expression flickered with annoyance, but he quickly smoothed it over. A misunderstanding. I was upset. Perhaps I acted hastily. But I'm willing to let bygones be bygones, if you'll come back with me and fulfill your end of the bargain. I would rather die. That can be arranged. The words hung in the air, cold and ugly. Elias moved before he was consciously aware of deciding to act, positioning himself between Lydia and Voss, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. You need to leave, he said quietly. Now. Harlan's eyes narrowed. Are you threatening me, Rowan? I'm telling you that you're not welcome here. And if you ever threaten her again in any way, I will put a bullet in you and let God sort out the paperwork. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Harlan laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You'll regret this, he said. Both of you. I have friends in this town, powerful friends. I can make your lives very difficult. Try, Elias said, and see what happens. Harlan held his gaze for another long moment, then turned and climbed back into his wagon. This isn't over, he called as he turned the horses. Not by a long shot. He drove away, disappearing into the trees, and the clearing fell silent in his wake. Elias turned to find Lydia standing rigid on the porch, her hands clenched at her sides, her eyes bright with unshed tears. It's all right, he said, climbing the steps to stand beside her. He's gone. For now, her voice was shaking. But he'll be back. You heard what he said. This isn't over. No, Elias agreed, taking her hands in his. But we'll face whatever comes, together. She looked up at him, searching his face, and whatever she found there seemed to steady her. Together, she repeated, and the word sounded like a vow. They stood on the porch, hands linked, watching the place where Voss had disappeared into the forest. The spring sun was warm on their faces, and somewhere in the distance a bird was singing. But beneath the beauty of the morning, something dark was stirring. A storm was coming, different from the one that had brought Lydia to his door, but just as dangerous. And this time, they would have to face it together. The days following Voss's visit were marked by a tension that settled over the homestead like a low-hanging fog. Elias and Lydia went about their routines, tending to the animals, working the land, preparing for the full arrival of spring, but there was a watchfulness in their movements now, an awareness that hadn't been there before. Every sound from the trail set Elias's nerves on edge. Every distant hoofbeat made Lydia's hand still over whatever work she was doing. They didn't speak much about the confrontation, but it hung between them, unacknowledged and unresolved. At night, Elias found himself lying awake long after Lydia had climbed to the loft, staring at the dying embers of the fire and turning over possibilities in his mind. What was Voss planning? When would he strike? And how could Elias protect the woman he loved from a man who seemed determined to destroy her? It was Lydia who finally broke the silence 3 days after Voss's visit. They were sitting at the table after dinner, the remains of their meal still between them, when she set down her fork and looked at him with an expression that was equal parts determination and fear. We need to talk about what happens next, she said. Elias nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that. And I think we need to get ahead of this. Voss is going to make trouble, that much is certain. The question is whether we let him control the narrative or whether we take it back. Lydia's brow furrowed. What do you mean? I mean we go to town. We talk to the marshal, lay out exactly what happened, put our version of events on record before Voss can twist things any further. He reached across the table and took her hand. And I mean we stop hiding. We stop acting like we have something to be ashamed of. We don't have anything to be ashamed of. I know that, you know that. But the town doesn't know it, not for certain. All they know is rumors and gossip. He squeezed her fingers. I think it's time we gave them the truth. Lydia was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. And the contract? She asked finally. The one Voss keeps waving around? It's worthless. Any judge worth his salt would take one look at what Voss did and throw it out. But if you're worried about it, we can make sure. I'll talk to the marshal. See if there's a legal way to have it formally invalidated. And if there isn't? Elias's jaw tightened. Then we deal with that when we come to it. But I'm not going to let a piece of paper determine our future. Not when the man who wrote it is a liar and a coward. Something in his words seemed to steady her. She straightened in her chair, her chin lifting with that defiance he had come to love. All right, she said. We go to town. We tell the truth. We stop running. Together. Together. They set out the next morning, the wagon rattling down the muddy spring road toward Bitter Creek. The day was overcast, the sky a uniform gray that threatened rain without quite delivering it, and the air had a bite to it that spoke of winter's reluctance to fully release its grip on the land. Lydia sat beside Elias on the wagon seat, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed but pale. She had dressed carefully for the occasion, in the best dress she had been able to make from the fabric they had bought on their last trip to town. It was simple, practical, but it fit her well, and Elias thought she had never looked more beautiful. Nervous? He asked. Terrified, she admitted, but I've learned that being afraid is not the same as being helpless. I can be both terrified and determined at the same time. That's one of the things I love about you. She looked at him sharply, and he realized with a start that it was the first time he had used the word love so directly, so casually, as if it were a simple fact rather than a momentous declaration. I mean it, he said quietly. I love you, Lydia. I should have said it before now. I should have said it 100 times. Her eyes softened and a small smile curved her lips. I love you too, she said, in case that wasn't already abundantly clear. He reached over and took her hand, holding it as they continued down the road, and the gray day seemed suddenly brighter. They reached Bitter Creek near midday and found the town in its usual state of quiet industry. Smoke rose from chimneys, horses stood tied to hitching posts outside the saloon, and a handful of townspeople moved along the wooden sidewalks, going about their business. Elias pulled up in front of the marshal's office, a small building at the end of the main street, and helped Lydia down from the wagon. They stood for a moment, gathering themselves, and then walked inside. Marshal Tom Brennan was at his desk, a cup of coffee in one hand and a stack of papers in front of him. He looked up as they entered, his weathered face registering surprise and then something that might have been approval. Rowan, Miss Granger. He set down his cup and rose to his feet. Wasn't expecting to see you two in town. We need to talk, Elias said. About Harlan Voss. The marshal's expression grew serious. I figured this was coming. Have a seat, both of you. Tell me what's going on. They sat, and Lydia began to talk. She told the story from the beginning, from the advertisement she had answered in Philadelphia to the letters she had exchanged with Voss, from her arrival in Montana to the moment he had left her to die in the blizzard. She spoke clearly and calmly, without embellishment or self-pity, laying out the facts in a way that left no room for doubt. When she finished, the marshal was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the wall of his office. Then he let out a long breath and shook his head. I always knew Voss was a piece of work, he said. But this is something else. He looked at Lydia with something like admiration. You're a brave woman, Miss Granger. What you survived, what you've been through, not many people could come out the other side as strong as you have. I had help, Lydia said, glancing at Elias. I wouldn't have survived without Mr. Rowan. I'm sure that's true. The marshal turned to Elias. And you, taking her in, giving her shelter, standing up to Voss, that took guts. It was the right thing to do, Elias said simply. Anyone would have done the same. No, the marshal said flatly. They wouldn't have. Not everyone is willing to stick their neck out for a stranger, especially when there's a man like Voss on the other side. He leaned back in his chair, considering. So, what do you want me to do? We want the contract invalidated, Elias said. Formally, legally, so Voss can't use it to make any claims against Lydia. And we want it on record what he did, Lydia added. The abandonment, the threats, all of it. So if anything happens to us, people will know the truth. The marshal nodded slowly. I can do that. The contract part will take some time. We'll need to get a judge involved, probably the circuit court out of Helena. But I can write up a formal complaint against Voss. Document everything you've told me. Make sure there's a paper trail. He paused. It won't stop him from causing trouble. A man like Voss doesn't care much about legality, but it might give him pause, knowing that whatever he does will have consequences. That's all we're asking, Elias said. A fair chance. You'll have it. The marshal stood and extended his hand, first to Elias, then to Lydia. I'll start the paperwork today, and I'll have a word with Voss, make it clear that I'm watching him. It might not be much, but it's something. They thanked him and left the office, stepping out into the gray afternoon. The clouds had thickened while they were inside, and a light rain had begun to fall, misting the air with moisture. Well, Lydia said, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. That went better than I expected. Brennan's a good man, Elias said. He'll do right by us. And Voss? Elias looked down the street toward the saloon, where he could see Voss's distinctive wagon parked outside. Voss will do what Voss does, but at least now we're not fighting alone. They walked to the general store to complete their shopping, moving through the aisles with the ease of familiarity. Ezekiel Marsh greeted them warmly, and several other townspeople stopped to exchange pleasantries, their manner noticeably friendlier than it had been on previous visits. Word of Martha Henderson's endorsement had clearly spread, and the tide of public opinion was beginning to turn. It was as they were loading their purchases into the wagon that Lydia suddenly stiffened, her hand freezing on the bag of flour she was lifting. Don't look, she said quietly. But he's watching us. Elias didn't need to ask who she meant. He finished securing the supplies and then, with deliberate casualness, turned to scan the street. Harlan Voss was standing on the porch of the saloon, a drink in his hand, his eyes fixed on them with an intensity that made Elias's skin crawl. Their eyes met across the distance, and Voss raised his glass in a mocking salute. Elias held the gaze for a long moment, letting his expression convey everything he couldn't say aloud. Then he turned away, helped Lydia onto the wagon seat, and climbed up beside her. He's trying to intimidate us, he said as they drove out of town. Don't let him. I'm not, Lydia said, but her hands were trembling slightly in her lap. I'm just remembering. The look on his face when he left me on the road. He had that same smile then, like he was enjoying it. He's a sick man, Elias said grimly, but sick men can still be stopped. We just have to be smarter than he is. And if being smart isn't enough? Elias didn't answer immediately. His hand dropped to his hip where his pistol sat in its worn leather holster. He had never killed a man in his life, had never wanted to. But for Lydia, for their future, he would do whatever was necessary. It will be enough, he said finally. It has to be. The rain grew heavier as they made their way home, the sky darkening to an early twilight that turned the familiar landscape into something strange and vaguely threatening. By the time they reached the cabin, they were both soaked through, and Lydia was shivering despite the relative warmth of the spring evening. Elias got the fire going while she changed into dry clothes, and soon the cabin was filled with warmth and the smell of coffee brewing. They sat together by the hearth, wrapped in blankets, watching the flames dance and listening to the rain drumming on the roof. Tell me about your dreams, Elias said suddenly. Lydia looked at him, surprised. My dreams? For the future. What do you see when you imagine the life you want to live? She was quiet for a moment, considering the question. I used to dream about safety, she said finally. Just that. A place where I didn't have to be afraid. A life where I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next blow to fall. She paused. But now I dream about more than just safety. I dream about this place. About the garden we'll plant when the ground warms up. About the chickens we'll raise and the bread I'll bake, and the long winter evenings we'll spend reading by the fire. She looked at him, her eyes soft. I dream about growing old with you, Elias. About building something together that will last. His heart swelled at her words. That's what I dream about too, he said. And I promise you, we'll make it happen, whatever it takes. She leaned her head against his shoulder and he wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the cabin there was only warmth and safety and the quiet certainty of love. But even as they held each other, a shadow loomed on the horizon. Harlan Voss was not the kind of man to accept defeat gracefully, and somewhere in the darkness of the night, plans were being made that would test everything they had built. The spring continued its slow conquest of the valley, each day bringing new signs of renewal. The grass turned green on the hillsides, Wildflowers began to bloom in sheltered spots, and the livestock grew fat on the fresh pasture. It was a time of hope, of new beginnings, and Elias found himself feeling lighter than he had in years. He and Lydia had fallen into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. They worked side by side during the days, she in her garden and kitchen, he in the fields and barn. In the evenings, they read together, talked together, laughed together. And at night, though they still maintained separate sleeping quarters, there was an intimacy between them that went beyond physical closeness. They knew each other now, in the way that only people who have weathered storms together can know each other. Martha Henderson had taken Lydia under her wing, inviting her to the weekly sewing circle that met at her house. At first, Lydia had been reluctant to go, wary of the judgment of the other women, but Martha had insisted. "They need to see you," she had said firmly. "Not the rumors, not the gossip, but you. The real Lydia Granger. Once they do, they'll come around." She had been right. One by one, the women of Bitter Creek had warmed to Lydia, won over by her skill with a needle, her quiet wit, and her obvious devotion to Elias. By mid-spring, she had become a regular fixture at community gatherings, and the whispers that had followed her in town had largely subsided. "You're really settling in," Elias observed one evening, watching her sort through a basket of fabric she had acquired at the last sewing circle. "I suppose I am," she said, holding up a length of blue calico to the light. "It's strange. A few months ago, I couldn't imagine belonging anywhere. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else." "You belong here," he said simply. "You always did. It just took us a while to find each other." She smiled at him, that radiant smile that still made his heart skip a beat. "Speaking of finding each other," she said, setting down the fabric, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." "What's that?" She hesitated, and he saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face. Do you ever wish things had been different? That you'd met me some other way, under better circumstances?" Elias considered the question carefully. "No," he said finally. "I don't. I know that sounds strange, given everything you went through. But if things had been different, if Voss hadn't been the bastard he is, you might have married him. You might have ended up trapped in a life that made you miserable. And we might never have met at all." He reached out and took her hand. "I hate what you suffered. I hate that you were hurt and frightened and alone. But I can't hate the path that led you to my door, because that path led you to me." Lydia's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Sometimes I think you're too good to be real," she whispered. "I'm real," he assured her. "Flawed and stubborn and set in my ways, but real, and completely, utterly yours." She leaned forward and kissed him, and the world narrowed to the two of them, the fire crackling beside them, the spring rain pattering against the windows. It was a moment of perfect peace, a bubble of happiness that seemed impervious to the troubles of the world beyond. But bubbles, by their nature, are fragile things. The trouble came 3 weeks later, on a morning that started out like any other. Elias had risen early to check on a mare that was due to foal, and Lydia had stayed behind to prepare breakfast. It was a routine they had established over months, comfortable and familiar. He was in the barn, checking the mare's condition, when he heard the sound of horses approaching. Multiple horses, moving fast. He straightened, his hand automatically dropping to the pistol at his hip, and moved to the barn door. What he saw made his blood run cold. There were 5 of them. Harlan Voss at the front, mounted on a black gelding, his face set in an expression of cold triumph. Behind him, 4 men Elias didn't recognize, rough-looking characters with the hard eyes of men who had long ago stopped caring about right and wrong. And riding beside Voss, his weathered face grim but determined, was Marshal Tom Brennan. Elias stepped out of the barn, positioning himself between the approaching riders and the cabin. "What's this about, Tom?" The marshal pulled up his horse and dismounted, his movements slow and reluctant. He couldn't quite meet Elias's eyes. "I'm sorry, Elias. I tried. I really did. But Voss went over my head. He's got connections in Helena, people who owe him favors." "What kind of connections?" "The kind that can issue warrants." Tom pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat and handed it over. "There's a judge who says the original contract is still valid. says Miss Granger is legally bound to Voss until the marriage is either consummated or formally annulled. And since there's been no annulment, that's insane, Elias said, his voice tight with controlled fury. You know what he did to her. You know the contract should be void. I know, but the law is the law, and the law says Voss has a claim. The marshal's face was anguished. I'm here to ensure things don't get ugly, to make sure everyone walks away from this intact. But I can't stop what's happening. I don't have the authority. Voss swung down from his horse, that smug smile spreading across his face like a stain. You heard the man, Rowan. The law is on my side. Now step aside and let me collect what's mine. She's not yours. Elias's hand tightened on his pistol. She never was, and she never will be. The warrant says otherwise. Voss took a step forward, his hired men spreading out behind him. Don't make this harder than it has to be. I've got 4 guns at my back and the law on my side. You're outnumbered and outmatched. Just let me take her, and we can all go about our business. Over my dead body. Voss's smile widened. That can be arranged. The cabin door opened behind Elias, and Lydia emerged onto the porch. Her face was pale, but composed, her spine straight, her eyes blazing with a fury that Elias had never seen before. No, she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. No more. I'm done being talked about like I'm not even here. I'm done being treated like property, like something to be bought and sold and discarded at will. She walked forward until she was standing beside Elias, her shoulder touching his. You want to take me, Mr. Voss? Then you'll have to look me in the eye while you do it. Voss's expression flickered, but he recovered quickly. Miss Granger, still as spirited as ever, I see. That's one of the things I liked about you, back when I thought you might be worth the trouble. And what changed your mind? You did. The moment I saw you in person, looking nothing like the picture you sent, I knew I'd been cheated. But I'm a forgiving man. I'm willing to overlook your deception if you come quietly. Lydia laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that held no humor. My deception? That picture was taken 3 months before I came to Montana. I looked exactly like myself. You're the one who built up some fantasy in your head, some image of what you wanted me to be. And when I didn't match your imagination, you threw me away like garbage. And now I've changed my mind. Voss took another step forward. Turns out you clean up better than I expected. You've got more spine than I gave you credit for, and I've got a ranch that needs a woman's touch. He smiled. Who knows? We might even be happy together. I would rather die. Yes, you've said that before. His eyes moved to Elias, cold and calculating. But what about him? Would you rather he died? The threat hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. Lydia's hand found Elias's, her fingers intertwining with his. If you hurt him, she said, her voice trembling with barely controlled rage, I will find a way to destroy you. If it takes me the rest of my life, I will make you pay for every drop of his blood. Strong words for a woman who's about to lose everything. Voss gestured to his men. Take her. Wait. The word came from an unexpected source. Marshal Brennan stepped forward, his hand raised. Just wait. There might be another way. Another way? Voss's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? The warrant says Miss Granger is bound to you until the marriage is consummated or annulled. But it also says that if she enters into a legal marriage with another party before that happens, the original contract becomes void. He looked at Elias. If you marry her, right now, Voss loses all claim to her. Legally, completely, permanently. Silence fell over the clearing. Elias felt Lydia's hand tighten in his as the implications of the marshal's words sank in. Is that true? She asked. Tom nodded. It's true. I checked with the circuit judge myself before all this went down. He said a new marriage would supersede the old contract. Voss's lawyers didn't think to close that loophole because they never imagined you'd find someone willing to marry you on such short notice. Well, they imagined wrong. Elias turned to face Lydia, taking both her hands in his. I know this isn't how we planned it. I know you deserve a proper proposal, a proper ceremony, all the things you dreamed about. But I love you, Lydia. I love you more than I've ever loved anyone or anything. And if marrying you right here, right now, is what it takes to keep you safe, then that's what I want to do. He took a breath, his eyes never leaving hers. Will you marry me? Lydia's eyes were bright with tears, but she was smiling now, that radiant smile that lit up her whole face. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you. Today, tomorrow, forever. Yes, this is ridiculous. This is—" Voss's voice was sharp with fury. "You can't just perform a marriage in the middle of a field. There are requirements, paperwork, legal procedures." "Actually," Tom said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice, "in the territory of Montana, a marriage can be performed by any ordained minister, or, in areas without regular access to clergy, by a duly appointed representative of the law, which happens to include me." Voss's face went red with rage. "You set this up," he accused. "You planned this whole thing. I just know the law, Voss, something you should have paid more attention to before you started waving that warrant around." For a long moment, Voss stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his eyes blazing with impotent fury. His hired men shifted uneasily, clearly uncertain about what to do. They had been brought here to intimidate, perhaps to use force, but a wedding was not something that could be stopped with guns. "Do it," Lydia said, turning to the marshal. "Marry us. Right now." Tom nodded and stepped forward, his weathered face solemn. "Elias Rowan, do you take this woman, Lydia Granger, to be your lawful wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Elias said, his voice steady and sure. "And Lydia Granger, do you take this man, Elias Rowan, to be your lawful wedded husband, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Lydia said, and her voice was strong and clear, without a trace of the fear that had haunted her for so long. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I pronounce you husband and wife." Tom smiled. "You may kiss your bride." Elias pulled Lydia into his arms and kissed her, deeply and thoroughly, pouring all his love and relief and joy into that single moment of contact. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, and there were tears streaming down Lydia's cheeks. "It's over," she whispered. "It's really over." "It's over," he confirmed. "You're my wife now, and no one, not Voss, not anyone, can ever take you away from me." Behind them, Voss let out a sound that was half growl, half scream of frustration. "This isn't legal," he snarled. "I'll contest it. I'll take it to the highest court in the territory." "You'll lose," Tom said flatly. The marriage was performed in accordance with territorial law, with 2 witnesses present, and I'll sign the certificate myself. Any judge who looks at this case will see a woman who was abandoned by her supposed husband-to-be, rescued by a good man, and legally married to that man before any other claims could be enforced. He looked at Voss with undisguised contempt. "Give it up, Harlan. You've lost. Go home before you make things worse for yourself." For a long, tense moment, Voss stood motionless, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. His hand twitched toward the gun at his hip, and Elias tensed, ready to push Lydia behind him at the first sign of trouble. But then, slowly, the tension drained out of Voss's body. His shoulders slumped, his hand fell to his side, and he turned away without another word. He mounted his horse, gestured curtly to his men, and rode out of the clearing without looking back. They watched him go in silence, the hoofbeats fading into the distance until there was nothing left but the sound of the wind in the trees and the distant call of a bird. "Well," Tom said, breaking the silence. "That went better than expected." Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thank you, Tom, for everything." "Just doing my job." The marshal tipped his hat. "I'll file the marriage certificate today. Make sure everything is legal and above board." He paused. "And I'll keep an eye on Voss. He's not the kind of man who accepts defeat gracefully. There might be more trouble down the line." "Let him come," Lydia said, her arm wrapped around Elias's waist. "I'm not afraid of him anymore. I have a husband now, and a home, and a future. He can't touch any of that." Tom smiled. "I believe you, Mrs. Rowan. I truly do." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Elias and Lydia standing in the clearing, their arms around each other, the spring sun warm on their faces. Mrs. Rowan? Lydia said softly, testing the words on her tongue. I like the sound of that. So do I. Elias kissed her forehead. So do I. The cabin seemed different when they went back inside. It was the same rough-hewn log walls, the same worn furniture, the same view of the valley through the windows. But everything felt transformed, infused with new meaning. It was their home now, truly and officially, the foundation upon which they would build their life together. Lydia moved through the space with new eyes, seeing not what it was, but what it could become. A proper kitchen with room for a real stove, a bedroom they could share, not just a sleeping loft. A nursery, perhaps, someday, when the time was right. You're thinking again, Elias observed, watching her from the doorway. I'm planning, she corrected. There's a difference. Is there? She turned to face him, her eyes bright with excitement. We're married now. Really married. That means we can do all the things we talked about. The garden, the chickens, the improvements to the cabin. We can build a real life here, Elias, a life that's ours. I know. He crossed to her and took her hands. But there's no rush. We have all the time in the world. Do we? She looked at him searchingly. What Tom said about Voss. About him not accepting defeat gracefully. Do you think he'll try again? Elias considered the question carefully. I think Voss is the kind of man who never forgets a grudge. But I also think he's smart enough to know when he's beaten. The law is on our side now. The town is on our side. If he tries anything else, he'll only make things worse for himself. You really believe that? I believe that we're stronger together than he could ever be alone. And I believe that love is more powerful than hate. He smiled. It sounds naive, I know. But I've lived long enough to know that the things that last, the things that matter, are built on love. Voss has nothing but anger and spite. Those things burn hot, but they burn out fast. What we have will last forever. Lydia's eyes softened, and she leaned into him, resting her head against his chest. I love you, she murmured. Have I told you that today? About a dozen times, but I never get tired of hearing it. Good, because I never get tired of saying it. She lifted her head and kissed him, softly at first, then with growing passion. Take me to bed, husband. We have a marriage to consummate. Heat flared in Elias's eyes. Here? Now? Here. Now. Unless you have objections? He swept her up in his arms, making her gasp with surprised laughter. No objections at all, Mrs. Rowan. None at all. In the days that followed, life on the Rowan homestead settled into a new and blissful rhythm. They were truly partners now, in every sense of the word, sharing not just the work, but the dreams and hopes that came with building a future together. Word of the impromptu wedding spread quickly through Bitter Creek, carried by the unstoppable engine of small-town gossip. But this time, the gossip was mostly positive. People spoke admiringly of Elias's loyalty and Lydia's courage. They spoke of how the marshal had outsmarted Voss, how the law had triumphed over cruelty. And they spoke of love, that mysterious force that had brought two strangers together and forged them into something unbreakable. Martha Henderson was one of the first to offer her congratulations, arriving at the cabin with a basket of food and a beaming smile. I knew it, she declared, embracing Lydia warmly. The moment I saw you two together, I knew. There's something about the way he looks at you, dear, something that can't be faked. Is it that obvious? Lydia asked, blushing. To anyone with eyes. Martha patted her cheek affectionately. Now, we need to talk about a proper celebration. The sewing circle is already planning a reception. Nothing too fancy, just a gathering at my place to properly welcome you into the community as Mrs. Rowan. Lydia's eyes widened. You don't have to do that. Nonsense. You're one of us now, and we take care of our own. Martha's expression softened. Besides, after everything you've been through, you deserve a little celebration. A chance to be happy without looking over your shoulder. The reception was held 2 weeks later, on a warm spring afternoon that seemed designed for celebration. Half the town turned out, bringing food and gifts and well wishes. There was music, provided by a fiddler from one of the nearby ranches, and dancing in Martha's spacious barn. There were toasts and speeches and more than a few tears. And at the center of it all, Elias and Lydia stood together, their hands intertwined, their faces radiant with joy. I never thought I'd have this, Lydia whispered during a quiet moment between dances. A community. People who care about me. A real home. You have all of it, Elias said. And more. You have me. That's the best part. She leaned up and kissed his cheek. You're my favorite thing about Montana, Elias Rowan. The mountains are nice, but you're better. He laughed, the sound rumbling from deep in his chest. I'll take that as a compliment. It was meant as one. She pulled him toward the dance floor. Now come on, they're playing our song. We have a song? We do now. They danced as the sun set behind the mountains, casting the valley in shades of gold and rose. And for a little while, all the troubles of the world seemed very far away. But the world has a way of intruding on happiness. And in the shadows beyond the dancing and the music, a darker story was still unfolding. Harlan Voss had not been seen in Bitter Creek since the day of the wedding. His ranch lay silent and still, the livestock untended, the fields unplowed. Some people said he had given up and moved on. Others said he was simply biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike. The truth, as it often is, was somewhere in between. Voss had spent the weeks since his humiliation in a haze of whiskey and rage. He drank alone in his empty house, nursing his grievances, replaying the scene in the clearing over and over in his mind. The look on Lydia's face when she said, I do. The triumphant smile on Rowan's face as he kissed his new bride. The pitying glances of the hired men as they rode away, knowing their employer had been beaten by a woman and a farmer. It was intolerable. It was unbearable, and it could not be allowed to stand. On the night of the reception, while the people of Bitter Creek celebrated at Martha Henderson's barn, Voss sat in the darkness of his house and made a decision. He couldn't have Lydia now. The law had seen to that. But he could still take something from them. He could still make them pay for his humiliation. He reached for the bottle of whiskey, drained the last of it, and began to plan. Elias felt the change in the air before he saw any concrete signs of danger. It was a prickling at the back of his neck, a sense of wrongness that he couldn't quite explain. He found himself checking the locks on the doors twice each night, making sure his rifle was loaded and within easy reach, scanning the tree line whenever he went outside. You're worried, Lydia observed one evening, watching him check the windows for the third time that hour. Just being careful. That's not the same thing. She came to stand beside him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. What's wrong? He hesitated, not wanting to alarm her unnecessarily, but they had promised each other honesty, and he couldn't break that promise now. I don't know, he admitted. Something feels off. I can't put my finger on it, but something is coming. I can feel it. Lydia nodded slowly. I've felt it too. Like a storm brewing on the horizon. She paused. Do you think it's Voss? Maybe. Probably. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated by his inability to identify the threat. I just wish I knew what he was planning. The waiting is the worst part. Then we won't wait. Lydia's voice was firm. We'll prepare. We'll be ready for whatever he throws at us, and we'll face it together the way we've faced everything else. Elias looked at her, at the determination in her eyes, the strength in the set of her shoulders. This woman who had survived so much, who had emerged from the fire of her trials tempered and unbreakable. How had he ever lived without her? Together, he agreed, always together. They spent the next few days fortifying the homestead. Elias reinforced the doors and windows, set up a system of tripwires around the perimeter that would alert them to any intruders. He cleaned and oiled his weapons, made sure there was ammunition ready to hand. He even recruited a few of the neighboring ranchers to keep an eye out for anything suspicious, explaining that he had reason to believe Voss might be planning something. You really think he'd try something? Asked Bill Patterson, who owned the spread to the south. After everything that happened? A man like Voss doesn't accept defeat, Elias said. He broods on it, lets it fester. And when he finally acts, it's usually something nobody expects. Well, you've got friends here, Bill assured him. Anything happens, you send up a signal, and we'll come running. It was a comfort, knowing he wasn't alone, knowing that the community he had kept at arm's length for so many years had finally embraced him as one of their own. But it didn't entirely quiet the anxiety that had taken up residence in his chest, the sense that something terrible was approaching with the inexorability of a glacier. The blow, when it finally fell, came from an unexpected direction. It was late afternoon, the sky streaked with the colors of approaching sunset, when a rider appeared on the trail leading to the cabin. Elias, who was splitting wood behind the house, set down his axe and moved to intercept the visitor, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. But as the rider drew closer, he relaxed. It was just young Tommy Marsh, Ezekiel's son, a gangly teenager who sometimes served as an unofficial messenger for the town. "Mr. Rowan!" Tommy pulled up his horse, breathing hard. "Mr. Rowan, I've got news. Bad news." Elias felt his stomach tighten. "What is it?" "It's about Harlan Voss." The boy's face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "He went to Helena. Talked to some lawyers there. They found a loophole in your marriage, something about the ceremony not being properly recorded. They're saying it might not be legal, after all." The world seemed to tilt beneath Elias's feet. "That's not possible. The marshal performed the ceremony himself. He filed all the paperwork." "I know, sir, but they're saying there was some technicality, something about witnesses or the way the vows were said. I don't understand all of it." Tommy swallowed hard. "They're sending a judge out from Helena. He'll be here in a week. And if he rules against you—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Elias understood perfectly. If the judge ruled against them, their marriage would be voided. The contract with Voss would be reinstated, and Lydia would be right back where she started, trapped in a nightmare with no way out. "Thank you for telling me, Tommy." His voice was calmer than he felt. "Can you ride to the marshal's office? Tell Tom Brennan I need to see him as soon as possible." "Yes, sir. Right away." The boy turned his horse and galloped off, disappearing down the trail in a cloud of dust. Elias stood motionless for a long moment, staring after him, his mind racing. Behind him he heard the cabin door open and close, felt Lydia's presence at his side. "I heard," she said quietly. "What do we do?" He turned to look at her, at the face he loved more than life itself, and felt a surge of determination that burned away the fear and uncertainty. "We fight," he said. "We fight with everything we have. We prove that our marriage is legal, that Voss has no claim to you, that the law is on our side. And if we can't prove it?" He took her hands in his, holding them tightly, willing her to feel the strength of his conviction. "Then we run," he said. "We pack up everything we can carry, and we disappear. We go somewhere Voss can never find us, somewhere his lawyers and his money and his connections don't mean a damn thing. We start over, just the two of us, and we build a new life from scratch." "You would do that?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Give up everything? Your home, your land, your whole life?" In a heartbeat, he cupped her face in his hands, looking into her eyes. "You are my life, Lydia. The cabin, the land, all of it. Those are just things. Important things, things I've worked hard for, but things that can be replaced. You can't be replaced. You are irreplaceable." He kissed her forehead softly. "I will burn down the whole world before I let him take you away from me." Lydia's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling, that fierce, unbreakable smile that he loved so much. "I hope it doesn't come to that," she said. "So do I." He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "But if it does, we face it together. We face everything together." They stood there in the fading light, holding each other, drawing strength from each other's presence. The storm was coming, there was no doubt about that now. But they were ready, and whatever the future held, they would meet it side by side as husband and wife, as partners in every sense of the word. As Lydia had said, on that first night when she stumbled into his life from the heart of a blizzard, some things are worth fighting for. And this, what they had built together, was worth fighting for. The week that followed was the longest of their lives. Every day felt stretched to breaking. Every hour waited with the knowledge that their future hung in the balance. Elias threw himself into preparations, gathering documents, speaking with anyone who might serve as a character witness, writing to Helena himself to consult with a lawyer who came highly recommended by Martha Henderson's brother. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Frederick Cole, listened carefully to the entire story before rendering his assessment. "The case against you is thin," he said, shuffling through the papers Elias had brought. "Voss's lawyers are grasping at straws. They're claiming the ceremony was invalid because Marshal Brennan technically exceeded his authority by performing a marriage outside of town limits. It's a technicality, nothing more." But could it work? Elias asked. It depends on the judge. Cole leaned back in his chair. Judge Harrison is a fair man, but he's also a stickler for procedure. If he decides to interpret the law strictly, you could have a problem. And if he doesn't, then your marriage stands and Voss goes home empty-handed. The lawyer paused. There is one thing that would strengthen your case considerably. Name it. A proper church wedding, performed by ordained clergy with all the traditional elements. If you can do that before the hearing, it would render the question of the original ceremony moot. You'd be married twice over, and no court in the territory could argue with that. Elias rode home with new purpose burning in his chest. A church wedding. It was so simple, so obvious, that he couldn't believe he hadn't thought of it himself. When he explained the plan to Lydia, her eyes lit up with a mixture of hope and wonder. Do you really think it would work? Cole seemed confident, and even if it doesn't solve everything legally, at least we'd have a real ceremony, the kind you deserve. Lydia's expression softened. I don't need a fancy ceremony, Elias. I already have everything I want. I know, but I want to give it to you anyway. He took her hands in his. I want to stand before God and our community and declare my love for you. I want to put a ring on your finger and call you my wife in front of everyone who matters. I want to give you the wedding you dreamed about, even if it's not exactly how you imagined it. Tears glistened in her eyes. Then yes, she whispered. Let's do it. The preparations came together with remarkable speed, fueled by the goodwill of a community that had embraced Lydia as one of their own. Martha Henderson took charge of organizing, her formidable efficiency cutting through obstacles like a hot knife through butter. The minister of Bitter Creek's small church agreed to perform the ceremony. The women of the sewing circle worked through the night to alter a dress that had belonged to Martha's daughter, transforming it into something beautiful and fitting for a bride. And through it all, the shadow of the approaching hearing loomed over everything like a storm cloud that refused to break. The wedding was scheduled for Sunday afternoon, 3 days before Judge Harrison was due to arrive. It was cutting things close, perhaps too close, but there was no other option. They needed to be married properly and indisputably before the hearing took place. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring day that seemed designed by Providence itself. Elias stood in the small cabin, struggling with the collar of a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit, and wondered how his life had come to this moment. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Bill Patterson standing on the porch, a smile on his weathered face. Ready? Bill asked. As I'll ever be. Good, because there's quite a crowd gathering at the church. Seems like half the territory wants to see you two get hitched. They rode to town together, the spring air fresh and clean, the mountains rising majestic in the distance. Elias tried to calm the nervous flutter in his stomach, reminding himself that this was what he wanted, what they both wanted. But the uncertainty of the legal situation cast a shadow over even this joyful day. The church was indeed packed when they arrived. People filled the pews and spilled out onto the steps, farmers and ranchers and townspeople who had come to witness the union of two people who had captured the valley's imagination. Elias saw Martha Henderson in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. He saw Ezekiel Marsh and his wife, Tom Brennan, in his Sunday best, a dozen other faces he recognized from his years in the valley. And then the doors at the back of the church opened, and Lydia appeared. She was radiant. The altered dress fit her perfectly, simple white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. Her dark hair was pinned up with wildflowers woven through it, and she carried a small bouquet of the same blooms. But it wasn't the dress or the flowers that made her beautiful. It was the light in her eyes, the joy that seemed to emanate from her very being. She walked down the aisle on her own, having no father to give her away, but she walked with her head held high, her spine straight, her gaze fixed on Elias with an intensity that made his heart ache. When she reached the altar, he took her hands in his, and the rest of the world fell away. The minister's words washed over them like a gentle stream, familiar and comforting. They spoke their vows, the same vows that Tom Brennan had administered in the clearing outside their cabin, but this time there was no desperation, no fear, only the pure and perfect certainty of love. I, Elias, take thee, Lydia, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. I, Lydia, take thee, Elias, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. The ring that Elias slipped onto her finger was his mother's, sent from Texas in response to the letter he had written months ago. His parents had included a note expressing their forgiveness and their hope that they might one day meet the woman who had brought their son back from the darkness of his grief. "With this ring I thee wed," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. "With my body I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow." The minister smiled. "By the power vested in me by God Almighty and the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife." He turned to Elias. "You may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, reverent, a promise sealed with the touch of lips. When they broke apart, the church erupted in applause, and Lydia laughed through her tears, her face glowing with happiness. They emerged from the church into brilliant sunshine, greeted by a crowd that had only grown larger during the ceremony. Rice was thrown, congratulations were shouted, and for a few precious hours the troubles of the world seemed very far away. The reception was held in Martha Henderson's barn once again, transformed by the efforts of the community into something almost magical. There was food and music and dancing, laughter and tears and joy. Elias and Lydia moved through it all in a kind of daze, accepting well wishes, sharing dances, stealing moments alone whenever they could. It was during one of those stolen moments, standing together in the cool evening air outside the barn, that Lydia finally voiced the question that had been hanging over them all day. "Do you think it will be enough?" she asked quietly. "The wedding, the witnesses, all of it. Will it be enough to stop Voss?" Elias was silent for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know this. Whatever happens at that hearing, we face it together. We're married now, Lydia. Truly and completely married. No judge, no lawyer, no bitter, broken man can change that. Even if they void the legal certificate, they can't void what's in our hearts. But if the judge rules against us, then we figure out our next move, we appeal, we fight, and if all else fails, we do what I said before. We run. We start over somewhere new." He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. "I told you once that I would burn down the whole world before I let him take you. I meant it. There is nothing I won't do to keep you safe." Lydia buried her face against his chest. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I've been trying so hard to be brave, but I'm scared." "I know. I'm scared too." He stroked her hair gently. "But we're scared together, and somehow that makes it bearable." They stood there in the darkness, holding each other, drawing strength from each other's presence. Around them, the sounds of celebration continued, laughter and music floating out from the barn like a promise of better days to come. 3 days later, Judge Harrison arrived in Bitter Creek. He was a small man, bespectacled and precise, with an air of authority that belied his unremarkable appearance. He set up court in the town hall, a building that had never seen anything more contentious than debates over fence lines and water rights. Harlan Voss was there, of course, flanked by 2 lawyers from Helena, who looked like they charged by the syllable. He sat on one side of the makeshift courtroom, his face a mask of cold satisfaction, as if the outcome were already decided. Elias and Lydia sat on the other side, Frederick Cole beside them. Behind them, the pews were filled with supporters, people who had come to bear witness, to show their solidarity, to stand with the couple who had become symbols of something larger than themselves. The proceedings were long and tedious, filled with legal jargon and procedural arguments that made Elias's head swim. Voss's lawyers laid out their case, citing obscure statutes and questionable precedents, arguing that the original marriage ceremony was invalid and that their client's contract remained in force. Cole countered each argument methodically, pointing out the flaws in their logic, the weakness of their evidence, the fundamental injustice of their position. He produced the certificate from the church wedding, signed by the minister and witnessed by half the town, and argued that even if the first ceremony were somehow invalidated, the second was beyond question. Through it all, Judge Harrison listened impassively, his expression revealing nothing. Finally, after what felt like hours, the arguments concluded and the judge called for a recess to consider his verdict. Elias and Lydia emerged from the town hall into the late afternoon light, surrounded by friends who offered words of encouragement and support. But beneath the brave faces, everyone knew the truth. Everything hung in the balance. Their future, their happiness, their very lives together, all dependent on the judgment of one man. An hour later, they were called back into the courtroom. Elias took Lydia's hand as they walked back to their seats, feeling her fingers tremble in his grip. Judge Harrison cleared his throat and began to speak. "I have reviewed the evidence presented by both parties," he said, his voice dry and precise. "I have considered the legal arguments, examined the relevant statutes, and consulted my own understanding of justice and equity." Voss leaned forward in his seat, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "It is the ruling of this court that the marriage between Elias Rowan and Lydia Granger is valid and legally binding." The courtroom erupted. Cheers from the supporters, outraged protests from Voss and his lawyers, the sharp crack of the judge's gavel as he called for order. "Furthermore," the judge continued, raising his voice above the din, "this court finds that the contract between Harlan Voss and Lydia Granger was rendered void by Mr. Voss's own actions, specifically his abandonment of Miss Granger in life-threatening conditions. No court of law will enforce a contract where one party has so egregiously violated its terms." Voss shot to his feet. "This is outrageous. This court has no authority." "Sit down, Mr. Voss." The judge's voice was cold. "Or I will hold you in contempt." He waited until Voss, red-faced and trembling with rage, had resumed his seat. "The matter is closed. Mrs. Rowan is free to live her life with her husband, without fear of further harassment. And Mr. Voss—" He fixed the man with a stare that could have frozen water. "I suggest you go home and reflect on the choices that brought you to this point. The court is adjourned." Lydia turned to Elias, her eyes bright with tears of relief. "We won," she breathed. "We actually won." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, feeling the tension of months of fear and uncertainty finally begin to drain away. "We won," he confirmed. "It's over, Lydia. It's really over." Around them, their friends and neighbors surged forward, offering congratulations, embracing them, celebrating the victory. And through the crowd, Elias caught a glimpse of Harlan Voss being escorted out by his lawyers, his face twisted with impotent fury. Their eyes met for just a moment. And in that moment, Elias saw something shift in Voss's expression, something that might have been acceptance, or might have been the first stirring of a different kind of resolve. Then Voss was gone, swallowed by the crowd, and Elias turned his attention back to Lydia, to the celebration, to the bright and beautiful future that stretched out before them. They were free, they were together, and nothing would ever tear them apart. The years that followed the court victory unfolded like the pages of a book that Lydia had once only dared to dream about. The cabin that had sheltered her from the blizzard transformed slowly but surely into a proper home, expanded room by room as their needs grew and their fortunes improved. Elias added a bedroom first, then a proper kitchen with a real stove, then a porch that wrapped around the front of the house where they could sit together in the evenings and watch the sun set behind the mountains. The garden that Lydia had planted in those first uncertain spring days flourished beyond anything she had imagined. Vegetables and herbs grew in neat rows, providing food for their table and surplus to sell at the market in Bitter Creek. She planted flowers too, roses and wildflowers and lavender that filled the air with fragrance and brought color to the rough Montana landscape. And then, in the second year of their marriage, came the greatest blessing of all. Lydia knew she was pregnant before she told Elias, holding the secret close to her heart for several days while she marveled at the miracle growing inside her. When she finally shared the news on a quiet evening by the fire, Elias's face went through a journey of emotions that made her heart ache with love. Surprise, disbelief, wonder, and then joy, pure and overwhelming joy that spilled out of him in tears he didn't try to hide. "A baby," he whispered, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." "We are." She covered his hands with her own. "Are you happy?" "Happy?" He laughed, a sound that was half sob. "I'm terrified and overwhelmed and more grateful than I have words to express." He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of something precious and fragile. I thought I would never have this again. After Sarah, after everything, I thought this part of my life was over. And now we get to start again, Lydia finished softly. Together. The pregnancy was not easy. Lydia suffered from sickness in the early months, and there were complications that kept her confined to bed for long stretches. Elias hired help for the ranch, refusing to let her lift a finger, and spent every spare moment by her side, reading to her, talking to her, doing everything he could to ease her discomfort. The fear was always there, unspoken but present. They both remembered what had happened to Sarah. They both knew that childbirth on the frontier was dangerous, that many women did not survive, but they faced the fear together, as they had faced everything else. And when the time finally came, they were ready. The baby arrived on a crisp autumn morning after a labor that lasted through the night. The midwife who attended, a capable woman named Ruth, who had delivered half the babies in the valley, pronounced both mother and child healthy and strong. And when Elias held his daughter for the first time, looking down at her tiny red face and perfect miniature fingers, he felt something break open inside him that he had thought was permanently sealed. "She's beautiful," he breathed. "Lydia, she's so beautiful." "She is." Lydia, exhausted but radiant, reached out to touch the baby's cheek. "What should we call her?" They had discussed names for months, debating options, making lists, never quite settling on anything. But now, looking at the tiny life they had created together, the answer seemed obvious. "Hope," Elias said. "Her name is Hope." And so it was. Hope Rowan, born of love and perseverance, a living symbol of everything her parents had fought for. The seasons turned, as they always do, and the Rowan family grew and flourished. A son followed Hope 2 years later, a boy they named Samuel after Elias's father, in honor of the reconciliation that had finally taken place between Elias and his parents in Texas. The elder Rowans made the journey to Montana the following summer, and the reunion was everything Elias had hoped it would be. His mother cried and held Lydia's hands and told her she was the daughter she had always wanted. His father, gruff and uncomfortable with emotion, nonetheless pulled Elias aside and told him he was proud of the man he had become. More children came after Samuel. A daughter named Rose after Lydia's mother. Twin boys, Thomas and William, who were holy terrors from the moment they learned to walk. The cabin expanded again and again until it was no longer a cabin at all but a proper farmhouse, filled with noise and laughter and the chaos of a large and loving family. Lydia threw herself into the life of the community with the same determination she had brought to everything else. She taught sewing classes to the young women of the valley, helped establish a lending library in Bitter Creek, served on the committee that built the valley's first real school. The frightened, desperate woman who had collapsed on Elias's doorstep all those years ago was gone, replaced by someone confident and capable, a pillar of the community, a woman respected and admired by all who knew her. And through it all, the love between her and Elias only deepened. They weathered droughts and hard winters, sickness and setbacks, all the trials that frontier life could throw at them. They disagreed sometimes, argued occasionally, but always found their way back to each other. The bond that had formed in those first desperate days of the blizzard had proven to be unbreakable, tempered by adversity into something stronger than steel. Harlan Voss had faded from their lives almost immediately after the court ruling. He sold his ranch and left the valley, moving to California according to rumors, though no one knew for certain. For years, Lydia rarely thought of him, the fear and trauma of those early days receding into distant memory. But then, 5 years after the court case, he returned. It was late summer when Elias spotted the unfamiliar wagon approaching the farmhouse. He was in the barn, mending a harness, when he heard the creak of wheels and the clip of hooves on the hard-packed road. He stepped outside, shading his eyes against the sun, and felt his heart stutter when he recognized the figure on the wagon seat. Voss had aged badly. His hair had gone gray, his face lined and weathered beyond his years, his once powerful frame diminished by whatever hardships he had faced in his years away. He pulled up the wagon at a respectful distance and sat for a moment, making no move to descend. Elias walked toward him slowly, his hand resting casually near the pistol at his hip. Voss. Rowan. The other man's voice was quieter than Elias remembered, stripped of its former arrogance. I wasn't sure you'd recognize me. I'd recognize you anywhere. What do you want? Voss was silent for a long moment, his eyes moving over the farmhouse, the outbuildings, the fields golden with late summer wheat. He took in the children playing in the yard, the curtains in the windows, the roses blooming by the door. You've done well for yourself, he said finally. We have. No thanks to you. No. Voss's gaze dropped to his hands. No thanks to me. The cabin door opened and Lydia emerged, drawn by the sound of voices. She stopped short when she saw who was sitting on the wagon, her face going pale. It's all right, Elias called to her. Stay with the children. But Lydia had never been one to hide from her fears. She walked across the yard to stand beside Elias, her chin lifted, her eyes steady as she looked at the man who had once tried to destroy her. Mr. Voss, she said, her voice cool, but not unkind. This is unexpected. Mrs. Rowan. He couldn't quite meet her eyes. I know I'm not welcome here. I won't stay long. He trailed off, seeming to struggle with something inside himself. I came to apologize. Whatever Lydia had expected him to say, it wasn't that. She stared at him, speechless. I've had a lot of time to think, Voss continued, about the man I was, about the things I did, the way I treated you. He shook his head. There's no excuse for it. None. I was cruel and petty and vindictive, and you suffered because of it, because of me. Why now? Lydia asked. After all these years, why come back now? Voss finally looked up, and Lydia was startled to see the pain in his eyes. I'm dying, he said simply. Doctor in San Francisco gave me 6 months, maybe less. Something in my lungs. He coughed, as if to demonstrate a wet, rattling sound that spoke of illness deep within. When you know your time is short, you start to see things differently. All the grudges, all the anger, all the things you thought mattered so much. They don't matter anymore. The only thing that matters is making peace with the past before there's no more time left. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of history. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Voss said. I don't deserve it, and I know it. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry, truly sorry, for everything. Lydia looked at him for a long moment, this broken man who had once held such power over her life. She remembered the fear, the humiliation, the desperate cold of that blizzard night when she had thought she would die. She remembered the threats, the legal battles, the shadow he had cast over her happiness. And she remembered something else too, something Elias had said to her years ago about the things that last being built on love. Mr. Voss, she said finally, what you did to me was unforgivable. The cruelty, the abandonment, the way you tried to use the law to steal my life away. Those things caused me immense pain, and I carried the scars for a long time. Voss nodded, his shoulders slumped with defeat. But here's what I've learned in the years since then. Lydia's voice softened. Your cruelty led me to the life I was meant for. If you hadn't left me in that blizzard, I never would have found Elias. I never would have known this kind of love, this kind of happiness. My children, my home, my community, everything I hold dear, none of it would exist if not for that terrible night. She stepped forward, closer to the wagon, and looked up at him with an expression that was neither anger nor forgiveness, but something stranger and more complex. So thank you, Mr. Voss. Thank you for being exactly the monster you were, because your cruelty was the path that led me here, and I wouldn't trade this life for anything. Voss stared at her, his eyes glistening with something that might have been tears. You're a remarkable woman, Mrs. Rowan. Rowan's a lucky man. I know, Lydia said simply. I remind him every day. A ghost of a smile crossed Voss's weathered face. I'll be going now. I won't trouble you again. He gathered the reins but paused before driving away. For what it's worth, I hope you have many more years of happiness. Both of you. He turned the wagon and drove away, down the road that led out of the valley, out of their lives forever. Elias and Lydia watched him go until he was nothing but a speck in the distance, and then he was gone. Are you all right? Elias asked, putting his arm around her. I'm fine. She leaned into him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. I meant what I said. I don't forgive him, not really, but I've stopped hating him, and that's enough. They stood together in the golden afternoon light, watching their children play, listening to the sounds of the life they had built. And when Elias kissed the top of her head and murmured that he loved her, Lydia smiled and said she loved him too. Because she did, more than words could ever express. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows, its own challenges and triumphs. Hope grew into a beautiful young woman who had her mother's strength and her father's quiet determination. Samuel became a rancher like his father, taking over more and more of the work as Elias grew older. Rose married a young man from Helena and moved to the city, though she visited often with her own growing brood. The twins, Thomas and William, were still causing trouble well into their 20s, but it was the good-natured trouble of young men with too much energy and not enough sense. Elias's hair went gray, then white. His hands, once so strong and sure, grew gnarled with age. But his eyes were still the same pale blue that Lydia had fallen in love with all those years ago, and his smile still had the power to make her heart skip a beat. One summer evening, 20 years after that fateful blizzard, they sat together on the porch they had built so long ago, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. Their grandchildren were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. In the house behind them, their children were preparing dinner, the sounds of family life spilling out through the open windows. Do you remember the night we met? Lydia asked, her hand finding his. Every detail, Elias said. You were half frozen and barely conscious, and I thought you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Liar. I was a mess. You were alive. After everything you'd been through, you were still fighting, still surviving. He squeezed her fingers. That was beautiful. That's always been beautiful. Lydia smiled, the lines around her eyes crinkling with warmth. I've been thinking about that night a lot lately, about all the things that had to happen to bring us together. If Voss had been a decent man, if the storm had come a day later, if I had stumbled in a different direction, but none of those things happened. You found your way to my door, and nothing has been the same since. Any regrets? It was a question she had asked him before, years ago, in the early days of their marriage. His answer then had been immediate and certain. But now, with the weight of decades behind them, he took his time considering. Not one, he said finally. Not a single regret. Every hardship, every challenge, every moment of fear and uncertainty, it all led to this. To you, to our children, to this life we've built. I wouldn't change a thing. Lydia leaned her head against his shoulder, the familiar gesture as natural as breathing. Neither would I. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to rose to purple. One by one, the stars began to appear. The same stars that had witnessed their first meeting, their first kiss, their wedding under the cottonwood tree. The same stars that would continue to shine long after they were gone, long after their story had become just another legend of the Montana frontier. Grandma! Grandpa! Hope's eldest daughter came running up to the porch, her braids flying. Dinner's ready. Mama says to come inside before everything gets cold. We'll be right there, sweetheart, Lydia said, smiling at her granddaughter with a love that seemed to fill her entire being. The little girl ran back inside, and Elias and Lydia rose slowly from their chairs, their joints protesting the movement. They stood for a moment, looking out at the land that had been their home for so many years, the mountains that had witnessed their love story unfold. Ready? Elias asked, offering his arm. Lydia took it, leaning into him as they turned toward the door. Always. They walked inside together, leaving the door open behind them so the evening breeze could follow. Inside, their family waited, gathered around a table laden with food, their faces bright with love and laughter. It was, Lydia thought, everything she had ever dreamed of, everything she had traveled 1,000 miles to find, everything she had almost died for, in a blizzard that now seemed like a lifetime ago. And as she took her place at the head of the table, surrounded by the family she had built with the man she loved, she offered up a silent prayer of gratitude. For the storm that had nearly killed her, for the stranger who had saved her, for the life that had grown from that single act of kindness, branching and blossoming like the roses in her garden. A storm had brought her here, but love had made her stay. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The story of Elias and Lydia Rowan became legend in the Montana Valley, passed down through generations, told and retold around fireplaces on cold winter nights. People spoke of the mail-order bride who had been abandoned in a blizzard and found by a lonely cowboy. They spoke of the love that had bloomed between two strangers, of the trials they had overcome, of the family they had built. But the truth was simpler and more profound than any legend. It was the truth that Lydia had understood from the very beginning, from the moment Elias had opened his door and pulled her in from the cold. Kindness matters, love persists, and even in the darkest storm, there is always a light waiting to guide us home. Elias and Lydia lived out the rest of their days in the house they had built together, surrounded by children and grandchildren, by friends and neighbors, by the community that had embraced them as their own. They died within months of each other, neither willing to face the world alone, and they were buried side by side on the hill behind the house, under the cottonwood tree where they had spoken their first vows. On their shared headstone, carved in letters that would endure for generations, were the words that Elias had spoken to Lydia on that first night, when she was half frozen and barely alive, and he was just a lonely man with a warm fire and an open heart. "You're safe here. I won't turn you away." And beneath that, added by their children, "Together, always together." The wind still blows across the Montana mountains. The snow still falls in winter, blanketing the valley in white silence. And somewhere in a farmhouse that has stood for over a century, the descendants of Elias and Lydia Rowan still tell the story of how their family began. A story of a blizzard. A story of kindness. A story of love. A complete ending. No sequel needed. Just a legacy of hope, stretching forward into forever. The end.